On the 21st of February 2023, my wife and I actually went through with it and sold our house to buy Bitcoin. We paid off our outstanding mortgage, put a little aside for emergencies, and dived in head first. While this simple, engaging, and easy to listen to story is fictional, it's also rooted in my own journey. It's a story for anyone who wants to understand, benefit, and prosper from Bitcoin. Meet Peter, a humble London postman on the brink of the biggest paradigm shift of his life. It all starts with a chance encounter and a startling revelation. Driven by an unshakable curiosity, Peter and his wife embark on a transformative quest for knowledge that changes their world forever. As they delve deeper, they uncover astonishing truths about money, its creation, and the hidden mechanics of our financial system. Each step of their journey introduces them to fascinating and enlightened individuals who guide them towards a deep understanding of Bitcoin and its explosive rise. Their pursuit of knowledge even leads them across continents, each encounter bringing them closer to a profound and transformative awareness. This story is more than just a narrative. It's a wake-up call. It challenges you to rethink your investments, money, and the societal structures that you've always taken for granted. It's a tale that is revealing, shocking, and ultimately inspiring, with lessons that resonate universally. This audiobook is for those curious about Bitcoin, what it is, why it matters, and how it's reshaping our world. It's also for Bitcoiners seeking a clear and compelling way to share its revolutionary impact with others. Prepare to have your understanding of money challenged and your eyes open to the flaws of our current financial system. This book isn't just about achieving financial freedom, it's an empowering call to action for anyone ready to embrace change and seize control of their financial future. Chapter 1. Something is broken. He slung the sack onto his shoulders, as he had done thousands of times before, and set out into the morning. It was lighter than usual, and he was looking forward to finishing a little earlier. If there was one thing that Peter loved about being a postman, it was early spring mornings like this one. The air was clear, the streets were empty, and dawn was just starting to break. The fragrances of spring were in the air, the promise of summer beckoned. Peter had just turned 50, and he was very fit. Delivering the post by foot every day for the past 20 years or so had seen to that. Peter was one of those people who had all the potential, intelligence and curiosity to have done almost anything he wanted with his life, but had chosen a simple path. He adored the outdoors, and the thought of being cooped up in an office all day in front of a computer, or worse still, having to sit through endless meetings, more boring than the Queen's speech at Christmas, had never really appealed to him. More recently, however, he'd begun to have doubts about his choices. Opting for a different career would have bestowed him with more money, more options, and less financial worry. Peter had bought his first property in London together with his wife Susan some 20-odd years ago, when prices were lower and buying a property was just about possible for normal working people. They had since moved, and around 10 years ago also remortgaged, which meant taking on more debt. Now, with the cost of his mortgage increasing and prices rising everywhere, he was feeling the financial pressure more than ever. Despite working overtime whenever he could, Peter was finding it increasingly difficult to stay ahead. The rising cost of living gnawed at him constantly, and he felt the pressure in every aspect of his life. His savings were dwindling, and he wondered how much longer he could keep up with the mounting expenses. Most of his colleagues were in a similar financial position. As he continued his round, Peter, not for the first time, noticed all the expensive houses and newly built apartments that stood empty. They were well kept, gardens immaculate, and windows clean. But there was no sign of life. It always puzzled him, seeing such wealth unoccupied while he struggled to make his wages meet expenses. Why do people buy and maintain these places if they never intend to live in them? He wondered, feeling a pang of frustration. It seemed like every week prices in the shops went up, and his wages didn't go as far as they used to. He sighed deeply, adjusting the strap of his bag. Things were certainly getting worse. Peter was traditional in that he saw himself as the main breadwinner. His primary goal was to provide for his wife and his 14-year-old daughter, Katie. Susan was already doing part-time work to help, and this was fine because she enjoyed it. That evening, the TV news focused on rising costs and economic challenges. Susan knew that look on his face as she walked over with a cup of tea. "Everything all right, love?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "Just thinking," Peter said, taking a sip. "Prices keep going up, but our wages are stuck. Something's broken." Susan sighed. "I know, everybody's feeling it. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it?" he replied. "How are people supposed to keep up?" Susan shrugged. "I suppose it's just the way things are. There's nothing much we can do about it." Peter nodded, though he wasn't sure he could let it go. The world was changing quickly, and he wanted to understand why. He stood and walked over to the window. Looking out, he saw a suburban street and parked cars. He wanted to improve the family's finances and earn more freedom. But how? Chapter 2. Sold. Another lovely morning, Peter thought to himself. Once again, his bag was lighter than normal. He chuckled to himself, thinking that thousands of people pay good money at gyms to get the kind of exercise that he gets for free every day. At number 42, the word sold had been added to the for sale sign at the head of the driveway. As he opened the gate, a voice greeted him from the garden. "I'll take those off you, mate." "Oh, I didn't see you there," said Peter before adding, "Sold the house, I see." "Yes," said the man, "and good riddance. No more legalised theft by the bank and no more monthly mortgage payments for me." "Sounds good. Are you downsizing?" asked Peter. "No," the man replied. "We decided to sell up." Then the man hesitated, looking deeply into Peter's eyes, as if trying to gauge whether he would understand or judge him. Finally, he continued, "We're going to buy Bitcoin with the proceeds. We're going to be renting from now on. Then, in a few years, our plan is to buy the home that we've always wanted, hopefully in cash and completely mortgage-free." Peter was startled. "Bitcoin? You're brave." "You think so?" laughed the man. "It doesn't feel like it. I've put loads of time into finding out what Bitcoin is all about, and I'm convinced this is the right move. I'm sick and tired of scrimping and saving each month with no sign of light at the end of the tunnel." "Wow," said Peter. "Well, I hope it works out for you." And with that, he turned to continue his round. As Peter continued, he thought about the exchange of words that he'd just had. God, the idea of selling a house to buy Bitcoin seemed utterly reckless. That man must be deluded, he thought to himself. Peter knew little about Bitcoin. He'd heard that its price was incredibly volatile and how people had lost everything. Surely it was nothing but a mad gamble. It wasn't tangible. You couldn't hold it. There was nothing physical at all. How could it have value? Bitcoin was nothing but just computer code. Who'd pay money to own a line of code? It just didn't make any sense at all. He thought more while walking. Not only that, the government could also turn around and ban Bitcoin at any moment, and then it would be game over. And what about its use in crime? Peter thought. Bitcoin was known for being the currency of choice for criminals on the dark web. He couldn't fathom how something linked to such shady dealings could be a wise investment. Peter delivered the next batch of letters. What on earth could have motivated him to sell his house and home to basically gamble on something that was, well, almost certain to fail? The risk he was taking on a complicated and unproven madcap idea was extraordinary, he thought. Yet despite all this self-talk and his solid beliefs on the topic, Peter couldn't help but feel a small spark of interest. Peter was naturally curious, and he was no dummy. It was something about the man's confidence that was starting to niggle him. As he walked through the streets, delivering the post to homes that seemed to grow more expensive every day, Peter couldn't help but wonder if there was something he was missing. The thought lingered, refusing to be completely dismissed. Peter finished his round and headed home. He walked through the door. He found Susan in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and his daughter Katie in the living room, practicing some dance moves to music. A few months ago, she'd become obsessed with imitating dance moves that she'd found on the internet. "It's me," Peter said, and gave Susan a quick kiss on the cheek. "Did you have a nice day?" she asked, stirring the pot on the stove. "A day full of surprises," Peter replied, leaning against the counter. "You'll never guess what a couple on Forest Avenue are doing." Susan looked up with mild curiosity. "Go on, tell me." "They've sold their house and they're going to buy Bitcoin with the profits. I spoke to the owner and he said their plan is to buy a better house outright in a few years. So what do you make of that?" Peter said, shaking his head in disbelief. Susan paused, her eyes widening slightly. "Really? Bitcoin?" "Yes, Bitcoin," Peter replied, expecting her to laugh it off as a ridiculous idea. "It's utterly reckless. I mean, they will probably lose everything. Fancy investing in nothing more than computer code. Fools!" Susan nodded thoughtfully. It does sound risky. Peter felt a sense of vindication. "Exactly. Its price is always up and down. It's not backed by anything, and it's used by criminals. Oh, and governments could ban it at any day." "True," Susan agreed, surprising Peter with her calm demeanour. "Did you ask why they decided to do it?" "Well, yes, I did. The man just said something about being confident and that he'd done his homework," replied Peter. Susan had a thoughtful look on her face and seemed a little hesitant. "It's a bit of a coincidence," she said, "but, the other day I bumped into Jeff at the supermarket. We were complaining about how expensive everything is and the cost of living crisis. Just off the cuff, he said that if the government didn't stop printing money, we'd soon end up like Argentina, with an inflation rate of over 100% and the streets filled with homeless people. And then he said, laughing, I might have to get my hands on some of that Bitcoin to protect myself." "It just made me think," said Susan. Peter blinked, taken aback. "Think what?" Susan shrugged. "I think that it's interesting. I mean, I never thought I'd hear about somebody selling up to buy Bitcoin around here. So something must be changing." Then she laughed and continued, "It's getting harder and harder to keep up. I even heard that robo-taxis might be coming to the streets of London within the next 10 years. Peter considered her words. "No, utter madness," he said. Susan smiled. "Maybe, but it would be nice to know more about why he's so confident. Perhaps you could ask him the next time you bump into him again." Peter was surprised by Susan's interest. "I will. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to know more, just for the amusement factor, if nothing else." As they sat down to dinner, Peter couldn't help but mull over their conversation. Susan's openness to the idea had been unexpected. Chapter 3. What is money? Peter had been trying to catch Bitcoin Man for days with no luck. Finally, one morning, Peter spotted a removal lorry parked outside the house. Determined not to miss his chance, he quickened his pace. As he approached, he saw the man directing the movers, loading up the last of the furniture. Peter waved out and called, "Morning! I've been hoping to catch you for a chat." The man looked up and smiled. "Morning. I'm a bit busy right now, but okay, go on, fire away." Peter hesitated and then blurted out, "I've been thinking about what you said the other day about, selling your house to buy Bitcoin. I can't wrap my head around it. Why are you so confident it's the right move?" The man laughed understandingly. "You think I'm crazy, right?" "Not sure," replied Peter in a friendly tone. "Look, it's impossible to explain it in a couple of minutes, especially right now. But if you're really interested, the first step is to understand why Bitcoin is revolutionary. But you can't do that before you understand why the present fiat system is broken." Peter looked puzzled. "What for a system?" "The name for the current financial system we use," the man explained. "The best person to talk to about this is David. He's been buying gold for decades and knows everything you need to know about money and where it really comes from. Look, I'm busy, but David can be found at the Bowls Club down at Southwark every Wednesday evening at about 7. Peter felt even more confused than before. All right, thanks. I'll go and see if he'll talk to me. Thanks for the tip and good luck with everything." That evening, he told Susan what the man had said. "Let's go together next Wednesday," said Susan. "It's a nice place. We can have a walk and then go to the bowling greens and see if we can find out more." Peter was surprised by her enthusiasm. "You seem eager to know more." "I am," she replied. "Look, I'm tired of never having any money. And it sounds like this guy David might know the reason why we're always so broke." Susan and Peter had been together for over 20 years. Money had always been sufficient for most things, within reason, of course. But recently, Susan had become also much more aware that it was getting tighter. She respected Peter for his approach to life and had never wished that he earned more. However, Katie was getting older and therefore more expensive. Susan was a strong woman. She knew what she wanted, and she certainly wasn't one for following the crowd, a fact that had been more than apparent during the response to COVID. In her opinion, many of the COVID rules were just plain ridiculous and arbitrary and had little to do with safety. During that time, she had been more afraid of the madness that seemed to have befallen her fellow citizens than the virus itself, and had frequently got into arguments and trouble for refusing to conform. The following Wednesday, Peter and Susan made their way to the bowling green. The evening was cool and pleasant, perfect for a stroll. They walked hand in hand, enjoying the fresh air and the familiar scenery. As they approached the bowling green, they spotted a group of people playing bowls. Crown green bowls. Their laughter and chatter filled the air. Scanning the crowd, Peter picked out an older man who looked like a regular, standing just to the side. He went over to him and said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for someone called David. Apparently he knows a thing or two about gold." "Aha, that's him, sitting over there on the bench," came the reply. Peter and Susan made their way over. David was in his mid-50s. He was quite tall and very well built. He'd clearly done lots of work in the gym, although not recently. He wore a full beard, which partially hid a friendly but experienced face. "David?" said Peter in an inquiring tone. Yes, that's me. My name is Peter and this is Susan. I'm a local postman. I met someone last week who'd sold his house to buy Bitcoin. Then Susan said happily, we're just curious as to why. He pointed us in your direction. Apparently, you can tell us what money is. David nodded. I see. Gold and money. Two of my favourite subjects. How long do you have? He said, laughing. We're not in a rush, said Peter. Well, don't say that I didn't warn you. Take a seat, said David, as he gestured to two free spaces to his right and to his left. David leaned back on the bench, considering where to start. So, what is money and where does it come from? He paused and looked at Peter and Susan. Peter exchanged glances with Susan. Peter was the first to speak. Right then, well, money is what we use to buy things, right? It's what we get paid in for our work. True, David nodded. But what else? Susan replied, savings. We use it to save for the future. Good, said David. Anything else? Peter and Susan remained silent. We also use it as a way to measure value. If the price of something is £10, we understand its worth in relation to other things. Price enables us to decide whether something is good or bad value, David said. This means that money has three functions: medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. Okay, so where does the money come from? Asked David, smiling. The government, said Susan, before adding, the banks? Isn't the pound backed by gold? And in theory, you could even redeem your pounds for its weight in gold. David shook his head gently. That's a common belief, but it's false. The pound, like all other currencies today, is not backed by gold. It used to be, but that changed a long time ago. He leaned forward, first to his right and then to his left, at Peter and Susan. In the past, most currencies were backed by gold or silver. People could exchange their paper money for a certain amount of gold at any time. But in 1971, the United States decided to break that link. The dollar was removed from the gold standard, and since then, all currencies have been fiat, which means it has value because the government says it does, and people trust that it will be accepted for goods and services. David continued, seeing Peter and Susan's interest. You know, the fiat system we have today is quite unique in the history of money. It's an historical first in many ways, an experiment. Peter and Susan exchanged glances, intrigued. An experiment, Peter said. Well, David explained, for most of human history, money was backed by something tangible. As I mentioned earlier, commodities like gold, silver, and other precious metals were commonly used. That makes sense, Susan said. But now all we have is paper money. And digital, David replied. Paper and digital money started as a representation of commodity money. You could take your paper note to a bank and exchange it for a certain amount of gold or silver. This system was known as the gold standard, and it was in place for many, many years. Peter nodded. So what happened? When did things change? The big change came in the 20th century, David continued. Countries started moving away from the gold standard. The final nail in the coffin was in 1971, when President Nixon took the United States off the gold standard completely. Susan looked thoughtful. So what happened then? Well, when the gold standard vanished, currencies automatically became fiat currencies, David explained. It's legal tender, but it's backed by absolutely nothing. Its value comes from the trust and the confidence that the people have in the government that issues it. Peter frowned. Sounds a little bit like monopoly money to me. In a way, yes, David said. Trust in the government, trust in the economy, and trust that others will accept this money as a medium of exchange. This trust is absolutely crucial because unlike gold or silver, fiat currency has no intrinsic value. It's just paper, or in many cases today, just numbers on a computer screen. Susan nodded slowly. So what you're saying is that there is no limit to the amount of money that governments can create? That's right, said David. It also costs them nothing. That's incredible, said Susan. The other day I was reading that the government wasted £37 billion on the track and trace system during the COVID pandemic. I was wondering to myself where all that money had come from, because we were always being told that there is no money for community projects or anything. Bloody hell, we even had austerity for years on end. And then suddenly, all the money for track and trace and COVID was just created out of thin air. David nodded. Effectively, yes. And that's just the track and trace system. The entire COVID policy response is estimated to have cost between 310 and 420 billion pounds. All of it just created at the click of a computer keyboard. Is that really how they do it? Just click a few numbers on a keyboard, said Susan. To be fair, they do make it a bit more complex than that, replied David. The government issues bonds to raise money. Normally, these bonds are bought by investors, but when there aren't enough buyers, the Bank of England steps in and buys them. This process is called quantitative easing. By buying these bonds, the Bank of England effectively creates new money and injects it into the economy. Susan looked bamboozled. That sounds complicated. I'm not sure I understand. David chuckled. Exactly. And that's why understanding how money works is so important. It can seem like magic, but there are real consequences for the economy and for all of us. Peter looked incredulous. That sounds to me like poor housekeeping. It's actually much worse than that, David stressed. The entire COVID response cost the UK £400 billion. Interestingly, if the pound was still backed by gold at the time of COVID, the government would have needed to ask its citizens for the money in the form of tax. And I'm betting that the response from the people would have been very different to the one that we saw. That's the appeal of printing money. It allows governments to fund large expenditures without immediately raising taxes, which can create the illusion that these things are just being provided for free. 400 billion, said Peter slowly. Just for COVID, for paying people to stay at home and do nothing. And where does all this money go? None of it seems to end up in my pocket, that's for sure. If the government is always creating more money, shouldn't we all be getting richer? David shook his head. That's what you'd think. However, when the government creates more, it doesn't distribute it evenly among everyone. Instead, most of the money ends up in the hands of the rich and powerful, or rather, the people closest to the money creation mechanism. Peter and Susan looked puzzled. Put it like this, David continued. Imagine a farmer throwing feed to his animals. The strongest and the most aggressive animals get to the food first, eating their fill. By the time the weaker animals get there, only scraps are left. That's similar to how money enters the economy. Peter nodded, starting to understand. Makes sense. The wealth inequality gap is getting wider all the time. That's right, David confirmed. This whole process actually has a name. It's called the Cantillon effect. Those closest to the source of the new money, like banks, large corporations, and wealthy investors, benefit the most because they can use it before prices rise. By the time it trickles down to the rest of us, the prices of goods and services have already gone up and our purchasing power has decreased. Susan frowned. So that's why it feels like we're always struggling, even when the economy is supposedly growing. Yes, David said. The new money drives up asset prices, like stocks and real estate, making the rich even richer, while the average person sees, well, little benefit. Instead, they face higher costs for housing, groceries, and other essentials. Peter shook his head. You know, every day I walk past expensive apartments and houses just sitting empty, well maintained, but empty. And they're growing in number too. 10 years ago, there were hardly any. David nodded sympathetically. That's a classic example of how wealth is concentrated. The rich can afford to buy multiple properties and investments, driving up the price of real estate. The properties they buy often remain unoccupied because the owners are so rich they don't need to rent them out. Meanwhile, ordinary people struggle to afford homes and are just being priced out of the market. Peter hesitated for a moment before continuing. I want to ask you about gold because I know that's your interest, but first, I've always wondered why the prices of houses and property have increased so much in comparison to wages. How can people afford such high prices? David sighed. It's a complex issue, but it largely comes down to a combination of factors. One major reason is the availability of cheap credit. Over the past few decades, interest rates have been kept relatively low to stimulate the economy. This makes borrowing money to buy property much easier and cheaper. Susan chimed in. So people are taking out bigger mortgages because the interest rates are lower. Correct, David confirmed. And because the banks are willing to lend more as a proportion of people's wages, when interest rates are low, people believe they can afford to borrow more, which drives up demand for property. Higher demand leads to higher prices. Additionally, banks and financial institutions have developed various financial products like interest-only mortgages, which can make it seem more affordable to buy expensive properties. Peter nodded, beginning to understand. But that doesn't explain everything, does it? No, it doesn't, David agreed. Another huge factor is investment. Real estate has become a popular investment vehicle, not just for the wealthy, but also for institutional investors like pension funds and investment firms. They buy properties, often in bulk, which drives up prices even further. And because property values are generally stable and tend to increase over time, they're seen as safe investments. Susan looked thoughtful. So it's cheap credit and rich people buying up the housing stock? Yes, David said. But there's also the issue of supply and demand. In many places, there's simply not enough housing to meet demand, especially in desirable areas. This imbalance pushes up prices even more. Peter shook his head again. So it's all interconnected, but where does that leave people like us? In the shit, David acknowledged. Rising property prices mean that your wages don't go as far, and keeping up with mortgage repayments becomes increasingly difficult. This is why so many people are struggling. Peter turned his head to David. But you decided to buy gold rather than property or shares. Why? David smiled. People have valued gold for thousands of years. It's a tangible asset that has intrinsic value because of its properties. It's durable, divisible, and scarce. Unlike fiat currency, which can be printed at will, gold's supply is limited. This makes it a reliable store of value, especially in times of economic uncertainty or inflation. Susan nodded. So gold is like a safe haven. It's also a great investment. Here's an example. In 1970, the average price of a house in the UK was £4,300. Today, it's £280,000. So, if you bought a house in 1970, you'd have an increase of £276,000 or 6,284%. Not bad, right? That's almost unbelievable, said Susan. Maybe. But if you put that same £4,300 into gold in 1970, it would now be worth £488,000, an increase of £483,000, which means gold did nearly twice as well as property. But you can live in a house, said Susan. That's true, David said, laughing. But this example demonstrates one of the major characteristics of sound money, namely its ability to store value. Peter looked intrigued. And what about Bitcoin? How does that compare to gold? To be honest, I know very little about Bitcoin, admitted David. I don't understand. The guy who sold his house to buy Bitcoin pointed me in your direction, replied Peter. He's called Russell, said David. I've known him for years, and we've often talked about the problems of money printing. He knows I'm passionate about gold. All I can say is that if he's decided to buy Bitcoin, maybe he knows something that I don't. What a thought-provoking conversation, said Susan. I've never thought about money before. So basically, you're saying that the government is going to print money at an increasing rate. It will make us all poorer, and we need to find a way to protect ourselves financially. David smiled. In a nutshell, yes. The main point is that our current financial system is entirely dependent on issuing government debt and more money creation, which leads to inflation and devaluation of our currency. It's crucial to understand what's going on and take action. I have one final and probably stupid question, said Peter. Why did we never learn about any of this at school, and why is it never mentioned on TV? I mean, I remember the government announcing all the money they were going to spend on COVID, and no one in the media or on TV seemed to question any financial consequences. David sighed. That's a very good question, and it's not stupid. I believe those who benefit most from the current system are unlikely to want to educate the masses about how it makes them poorer. Keeping the general population in the dark makes it easy to implement policies that are not particularly in their best interest. Susan nodded. And what about the media? Why don't they talk about it? The BBC is regime central, said David. The establishment and the others are owned by large corporations that benefit from the status quo. They've no interest in sharing information that could lead to widespread questioning of the financial system. Plus, economic policies can be quite dry and difficult to explain in a way that captures the public's attention. Peter shook his head. So, it's up to us to educate ourselves and find out what's really going on. Precisely, David said. In today's world, information is more accessible than ever, but you have to do the work and educate yourself. The more you learn, the better equipped you'll be to make informed decisions and protect your financial future. Susan looked pleased. That's a lot to digest. Thank you, David. This chat has been incredible, although I'm not quite sure what to do with the information. David stood up and shook their hands. I'm glad I could help. Remember, the most important thing is to stay informed and make educated decisions about your financial future. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any more questions. Peter and Susan decided to go for a drink at the local pub to mull over what they'd just learned. As they settled into a quiet corner with their drinks, Peter started the conversation. Well, that was very interesting, Peter said, taking a sip of his beer. But even if what David said was true, I can't see how that knowledge could help us. We have no spare cash to invest in anything. All our money goes on paying the mortgage and living from month to month. You know the old saying, you need money to make money. Susan nodded in agreement, swirling her glass. Yeah, it's hard to imagine how we could start investing in anything when we're barely making ends meet. Peter sighed. We've already cut back so much. I don't know where else we could save. It feels like no matter what we do, we can never get ahead. Sometimes it feels like the only way out is to win the lottery, to be honest. Susan laughed, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Yeah, or some miracle where we suddenly come into a lot of money. Peter looked out of the window, his thoughts drifting. David made it sound so logical, but it feels so out of reach for people like us. I mean, look around. Most people are just trying to get by, not thinking about investing in gold or real estate, and certainly not Bitcoin. Susan sighed deeply. And the idea of investing in something like gold just seems far-fetched. We can barely cover our bills. Peter nodded. It's like we're stuck in a never-ending cycle. Every time we think we're making progress, something else comes along to set us back. Susan took a sip of her wine. And the thought of trying to educate ourselves on all this, it's daunting. Where would we even start? Peter leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of their situation. I guess it's hard to feel courageous when you're just trying to keep your head above water. Susan looked at him, a spark of determination in her eyes. But we have to try, right? We can't just keep going like this, hoping for a miracle. Peter nodded slowly. You're right. Maybe we start small, like David suggested. Learn a bit more, see if there's a way to free up even a tiny amount of money to start investing in something. Susan smiled faintly. And who knows? Maybe a small step will lead to something bigger. It's worth a shot, even if it feels like a long shot. Peter raised his glass. To making small steps and finding a way, even when it seems impossible. Susan clinked her glass against his. To not giving up. As they sat in the cosy pub, Peter and Susan felt the weight of their financial struggles pressing down on them. The conversation with David had been enlightening, but the reality of their situation seemed overwhelming. They couldn't help but feel a sense of hopelessness, wondering if they would ever be able to break free from the cycle of just getting by. Peter looked at Susan again. Maybe we should buy a lottery ticket and hope for the best, just in case. As they reached their home later that evening, they both knew they had a lot to think about. The future seemed uncertain. Chapter 4. Empty Houses. The borough of Southwark, London, is vibrant and diverse. Peter enjoyed delivering the mail here. There was always something happening and the weather was always changing. Walking down one of the streets lined with traditional Victorian terraced houses, many of them unoccupied, he noticed a man standing by the front gate, seemingly inspecting the small front garden. "Hi," Peter called out as he approached. "Nice day." The man looked up and smiled. "Morning. Sure is. I'm just checking that everything's in order here." Peter handed him a few letters. "I see this house is well taken care of, but I never see anyone living here." The man grinned. "That's right, we don't live here. It's just an investment." Peter's curiosity got the better of him. "If you don't mind me asking, why don't you just leave your money in the bank or buy shares? Wouldn't it be safe, with less tax and less work, to maintain it?" The man seemed pleased to talk about it. No, I don't mind. There's no better investment than property in the UK, especially in London. Values always rise. It's the safest bet. Of course, he continued, it would be much easier to park our money in the bank, but we would soon become poor. The interest rates on savings are tiny. We'd lose half our wealth to inflation in less than 10 years, and that would be foolish. We have to put our money into something that will keep its value, and that's property. Peter nodded, understanding. "So basically, you bought the house to protect your money?" "Spot on," the man confirmed. "Property increases in value over time, usually outpacing inflation, plus it's a tangible asset which gives me peace of mind." Peter thought for a moment. "But doesn't it cost a lot to maintain an empty house? You know, the council taxes and the rest. Isn't it a bit of a pain in the arse?" "It can be," the man admitted. "But over the long run, the appreciation in value more than makes up for those costs and inconvenience." Peter handed over the remaining letters, then hesitated before saying, "You know, the other day I had a conversation with a man over on Forest Avenue who'd sold his house to buy Bitcoin." Predictably, the expression on the man's face changed to one of surprise. "Bitcoin? Well, sounds a bit risky to me. I've read this and that about it, but to be fair, I don't understand it." Peter shook his head. "Me neither. The man over on Forest Avenue, though, just told me that he'd done his homework and that he was confident." The man rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I like to stick with what I know. Property, stocks, some bonds." And then he said, laughing, "You're unusually interested in investment for a postman. Are they not paying you enough down at the post office? Or have you stumbled across some sort of hidden treasure?" Peter laughed in return. "Treasure, that would be nice. The truth is that with all the prices going up, it's hard to keep up. The man selling up to buy Bitcoin just got me thinking." The other guy nodded. "I see, but it still sounds incredibly risky to me." "Ah, no problem," Peter replied. "Thanks for the chat. Have a nice day." As he continued his round, Peter thought more about all the other properties standing empty. He imagined all the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of top properties across the UK and probably the world with no one living in them, all because people wanted to preserve their wealth. He also thought about all the young people who were effectively being prevented from buying a home because older people with money were using these properties as a savings account. Later that evening, Peter and Susan were sitting together at the kitchen table, enjoying a quiet moment. Katie was in the living room again, practicing some more dance moves. Peter started. "I had an interesting chat today. I bumped into an owner of one of those empty properties. You know, one of those that I pass every day." Susan looked up, a little intrigued. "Oh? What did they say?" "It was a man, and he told me that he bought the house as an investment. He said it was a way to protect his money. He said If he just left his money in the bank, its value would halve in about 10 years because of inflation. Susan looked frustrated. It's absolutely outrageous. There should be a law against owning houses without using them, or a heavy tax. It's just so wrong for so many nice properties to stand empty while thousands of people struggle to put a roof over their head. Absolutely, Peter agreed. I was thinking about Mr. Bitcoin. I think David said that his name is Russell. You know, the man who sold his house to buy Bitcoin. He was effectively doing the reverse. Just imagine if all the fat cat property owners did the same and sold their houses and properties to buy Bitcoin. There would be thousands and thousands of properties freed up for real people to live in. Susan sighed. And pigs might fly. We still know next to nothing about why, what do you call him, Mr. Bitcoin, decided to sell up. Peter nodded thoughtfully. Okay, we need to understand more about it. Maybe there's something to it that we're missing. Susan picked up her mobile. Let's have a look if there's anything happening in London. Here we are. There's a meetup right here. Bitcoin London meetup at the Bitcoin Cafe. Come and learn all about Bitcoin. How's that grab you? Peter leaned over. Sounds right on the money. Pun intended, he said. It's next week. What do you think? Shall we go? Susan smiled. Yeah, let's go and find out what Bitcoin is. There'll be people there who know what they're talking about. Well, hopefully. Peter nodded, feeling a spark of excitement, but also slight trepidation. All right, let's do it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. The following week, Peter and Susan made their way to the Bitcoin Cafe, a cozy and inviting place that seemed to buzz with energy. The cafe was filled with people of all ages, engaged in animated discussions and just enjoying a drink together. As they walked in, Peter and Susan noticed a small stage set up at one end of the room with a banner that read, Bitcoin Meetup. Peter and Susan found a couple of seats near the front and settled in, eager to learn more. A friendly-looking woman approached them with a smile. Hi, I'm Emily. Is this your first time? Peter nodded. Yes, we're here to learn. We know nothing. Emily smiled warmly, taking the chair next to Susan. You've come to the right place. What's on your mind? Everything. Please keep it as simple as possible. Just imagine you're talking to a 7-year-old, said Susan before asking. All right, first question, what is Bitcoin? Emily nodded, her eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. All right, I'll try my best. Bitcoin is an electronic payment system that allows anyone to create an account and send any amount of money to anyone in the world with a Bitcoin address. Bitcoin is almost a miracle. No, really, I'm not joking. It's the most perfect money that humankind has ever invented. Peter was surprised at Emily's confidence and belief. This was going to be interesting. Miracle, said Peter. That's a bit strong, isn't it? No, it's not, insisted Emily. The circumstances of its conception can never be repeated, and the chances of it happening again are almost zero. Susie looked intrigued. What do you mean by that? Well, Bitcoin was created by an unknown person or group of people using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, Emily explained. In 2009, the initial version of Bitcoin was released and the first Bitcoins were created or mined. Then, incredibly, the creator, Satoshi, disappeared, leaving behind a system that no one person or entity controls. This means that the Bitcoin network is entirely decentralized. It belongs to no one. Therefore, the Bitcoin network can be trusted by everyone with complete confidence. Emily continued, think of Bitcoin like a colony of ants. In an ant colony, no single ant is in charge. Instead, each ant works on its own but still contributes to the colony's common goals, like finding food, taking care of their young, and protecting the colony. You said Bitcoin is the most perfect money ever invented, said Peter. But I don't know anyone who uses it, and I can't spend it in the shops. Emily nodded. You can in El Salvador. It's legal tender there. Oh, really? Said Peter. But it's not much help to us here in London. That's a fair point, said Emily. But you can't spend dollars here in London either. Just because you can't spend Bitcoin in the shops at home doesn't mean it's not money. Bitcoin is money. The pound note in your pocket is currency. I don't understand what you just said, said Susan. Let me explain, continued Emily. The pound, the dollar, and the euro, for example, are all currencies. In the case of the UK, the government decrees that the British pound, and only the British pound, is legal tender. That's why you can't buy a coffee with euros or dollars or any other currency here in the UK. The government enforced this using the police, the justice system, and, the threat of violence. You, Peter, are not actually working for money. You're working for currency. Peter looked puzzled. What's the difference? There's a big difference, said Emily. We've all been conditioned from a very young age to believe that currency is money, but it's not. Take gold, for instance. It was used as money for thousands of years. Even today, right now, I could probably go out into the street and find someone who would be prepared to exchange my gold for currency, which here in the UK means pounds. On the other hand, if I had some Venezuelan bolivars, that's currency, even piles and piles of it, I'm betting it would be almost impossible for me to go out now and find somebody ready to exchange it for British pounds. That's because gold is money and Venezuelan bolivar is not. It's currency. Politicians love currency because there's no limit to how much they can create. Just think about it for a moment. For you to receive, let's say, £2,000 in currency, you have to go to work each day for an entire month. That's over 160 hours of your time that you need to sacrifice to receive some currency. The government, on the other hand, can create billions of pounds in currency by issuing new debt with a few clicks on a computer mouse and absolutely no effort or time invested. Just imagine if gold was the currency of the UK. How easy would it be for the government to create a few additional tons of gold? Impossible, right? That's why governments hate money, love currency, and absolutely adore fooling people into believing that currency is money. The ideal money should be a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. Bitcoin has all these characteristics. It's also scarce, durable, divisible, portable, fungible, and easy to identify as real. These are the characteristics that make it perfect money. Bitcoin does all this and more in the modern digital world, the future world. Bitcoin is scarce, with a maximum supply of 21 million coins. It's durable because it exists digitally and can't be destroyed. It's divisible into small units called satoshis, and it's portable because you can send it anywhere in the world instantly. It's fungible because each Bitcoin is the same as any other, and it can be recognized as real because of the special codes that are used to secure it. Susan took a breath and said, "Wow, my head is spinning." Emily laughed. "I know the feeling. To be fair, it takes a long time and plenty of work to really grasp Bitcoin. Not because we're dumb, but because we have to overcome a lifetime of programming, propaganda, and lies. And that is difficult. Honestly, we don't have nearly enough time to cover everything tonight. It's a process. But for now, just remember these two things. Firstly, the supply of Bitcoin is capped at 21 million. It's impossible for more than 21 million Bitcoin to exist, ever. Secondly, Bitcoin is protected by the most secure computer network on the planet. It's never been hacked. Peter too was feeling a little overwhelmed. Although Emily had gone out of her way to explain everything clearly, it was still a lot to take in. All right, said Peter. I think that'll do us for tonight. Are you here every week? Tonight's meetup is monthly, said Emily. But feel free to come again. I'm sure you'll have many more questions. As they walked home, Susan was unusually quiet, lost in thought. Peter glanced at her, sensing the wheels turning in her mind. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Susan sighed, then smiled. "I'm just processing it all. It's like a whole new world. There's a lot to digest." Peter nodded. "But you seemed really engaged tonight. I was surprised." Susan paused, choosing her words carefully. "Do you know, I'm beginning to think that we might have been played like a fiddle." Peter wasn't expecting that from Susan. It was a very untypical remark. Excuse me?" said Peter in a questioning tone. "After our talk on the bench with David and after this evening, I'm becoming convinced that we need to make changes," said Susan. Peter looked at her, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Susan continued. "Look, both of us grew up with no money. There was never enough. My dad's response to almost everything was, 'I'm skint.' Well, to be fair, we were, but nevertheless, it means that I've always had that scarcity mentality. And I think you have, too," she said. "Over the past week, I've been thinking about it more and more. Maybe we need to open our minds to a different reality." Peter was silent for a moment, thinking. "I'm not sure I understand. Do you mean we've been following the crowd?" Susan replied, I'd not really thought of it in those terms, but now you mention it, yes. Perhaps it's time to find out more and stop just doing what everyone else is doing." Her eyes reflected a mix of determination and apprehension. "We need to educate ourselves, not just about Bitcoin, but about how all this finance stuff works. After all, we're probably being lied to by the government and the media about, well, almost everything." Peter smiled, feeling a surge of admiration for his wife. "You're a surprise." Susan laughed softly. "All this time I've been focused on keeping us afloat, just like my parents did. But maybe it's time to think more about just staying afloat. Maybe it's time to think about thriving." As they continued their walk home, Peter asked, "What struck you the most about this evening?" "The fixed limit of 21 million Bitcoin," said Susan. "I mistakenly thought that it's digital, so there can be an unlimited number. I didn't expect scarcity." "Interesting," said Peter. "Makes you think, doesn't it?" Chapter 5. 21 million. As they continued their walk home, Peter couldn't shake the thought of the 21 million coin limit from his mind. It bugged him. It demanded more of his attention and consideration. Later that night, after Susan had gone to bed, Peter sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring into space as his thoughts raced. He began to do the numbers in his head. All right, he thought. There are 67 million people in the UK alone. So if everyone in the UK wanted to own just one Bitcoin, that would be impossible. The supply of Bitcoin would have to increase threefold to meet that demand. He carried on. The population of the EU is 450 million and the United States is 330 million. Canada adds another 38 million, and then there's Asia with its vast population, easily over 4.5 billion people. Add in the rest of the world, and we're talking about nearly 8 billion people. Peter shook his head, feeling the enormity of the numbers. The implications began to dawn on him. And what about the millionaires? He continued to Google the numbers. Apparently, there are around 56 million millionaires in the world. So if each one of them wanted just one Bitcoin, that would already account for more than twice of the total supply. Peter drifted back to the deserted properties that he saw every day on his round. How many people are using property as a store of value? If they decided that Bitcoin was a better store of value, the demand for Bitcoin would skyrocket. And with such a limited supply, the price of Bitcoin would shoot up astronomically. He rubbed his temples, feeling a mix of excitement but also anxiety. If all these people, millionaires and investors, wanted a piece of Bitcoin, he didn't need to finish the thought. The potential for Bitcoin's value was almost unlimited. Peter put down his phone, turned off the light, and made his way to bed. Chapter 6. Doubts and Imposters. Peter had a large group of friends. In many ways, it was quite unusual. The group had known each other since their teenage years. Each had chosen a different path in life, but their friendship had endured. Now in their early 50s, they still enjoyed meeting up once a month on a Friday evening for a beer, some banter and a laugh. They knew each other well. It was 8 p.m. and they greeted and settled into their usual corner of the pub. After the first beers and the customary mickey taking had been concluded, Peter decided to bring up the topic that had been playing on his mind. I've been looking into Bitcoin, Peter said, taking a sip of his beer. His friend Dave immediately shook his head. Bitcoin? Peter, mate, I'm sorry to break it to you, but you've missed the boat. All the Bitcoin millionaires were minted years ago. Now it's just hype and totally overvalued. Peter raised an eyebrow. You think? Dave leaned in, his tone confident. Look, Bitcoin was worth pennies years ago. The people who got in early made their fortunes, but now it's just a bubble waiting to burst. I'd never buy at these prices. Do you even know what Bitcoin costs? Peter admitted that he didn't. The last thing I heard, said Dave, it was something around $70,000 a coin. Bloody hell, said Martin. $70,000 for a piece of computer code. Tell you what, come over to my house tonight and I'll write you some code and sell it to you for half the price, he said, laughing. Peter laughed with them. One of the great things about his mates was that you always got an honest response, regardless of how unreasonable or how cutting? Peter asked, Martin, do you actually know anything about Bitcoin? Only, said Martin, that it's the biggest piece of nonsense that I've ever heard. Oh, come on, said Russ. The biggest piece of nonsense was when we were told that somehow the unvaccinated were a danger to the vaccinated during the pandemic. The stupidity of all that still blows my mind, even to this day. Okay, you're right, replied Martin. Perhaps not the most nonsensical, but close. Despite the derogatory response, Peter pushed on. I'm only saying it because I met a man on my round who just sold his house to buy Bitcoin, and it got me thinking. What a lunatic, said Dave. The world is getting crazier by the week. It's hard to stay sane. Peter replied, But what if you're wrong, Dave? I'm not, came the response. Look, you know Simon Birch. He lost everything betting on crypto. He was so convinced that he went all in and ended up losing everything. I think that was in 2022, so not so long ago. Peter did know Simon. He'd often sat next to him at school. They'd always got along. Peter also bumped into him from time to time on his round because he lived in the same neighbourhood. Meanwhile, Michael, who'd been listening to the exchange between Peter and David and until now had remained silent, said, You know, there's a huge difference between Bitcoin and crypto. Dave was quick with his response. It's all the same shit. I mean, take that guy on your round. Does he really believe that Bitcoin is a better investment than property? With property, you get somewhere to live and it's real. You can actually touch it and I can see it. Peter felt a pang of doubt. But what if the price of Bitcoin continues to rise? That's the gambler's fallacy, Dave replied. It's all hype now. You're just better off sticking with what you know. Peter nodded slowly, absorbing Dave's words. The rest of the evening passed with the usual banter and laughs, but his mind kept returning to the conversation. Peter lived just 30 minutes walking distance from the pub and liked to stroll home, weather permitting. He thought about what his mates had said. He was particularly interested in what Dave had said about Simon and how he'd lost all his money. He knew Simon's address and decided he would go round to meet him tomorrow to find out what had happened and whether he really had lost all his money. Peter rang the doorbell. A familiar, friendly and smiling face greeted him. Peter, nice to see you, mate. Simon said, What brings you here? Peter explained the exchange that he'd had in the pub the night before, and Simon invited him in. You're in luck. Shelley has gone shopping, which is good because mentioning crypto around here is not advisable, he said in a jolly voice. Peter asked, I hear you lost everything on Bitcoin. Simon replied, I did, but not on Bitcoin, on Luna. Peter told Simon about his journey so far and the conversation that he'd had in the pub. Look, I'll tell you what happened, started Simon. I put a lot of my savings into Bitcoin in late 2020. I must have timed it perfectly because the price started going up fast. In just a few months, I'd quadrupled my initial investment. Simon laughed while saying, I thought I was a genius. In reality, though, I had no idea what I was doing. I started watching videos on YouTube by so-called gurus, and they were very convincing and upbeat about alternative crypto tokens. I was convinced that a crypto token called Luna was going to skyrocket in price. So I sold all my Bitcoin for a huge profit and put most of it into this Luna coin. At first, the price went crazy. In my mind, I was a better investor than Warren Buffett. And then, suddenly, in May 2022, within just 3 days, the value of Luna crashed to almost nothing. Peter said, I see, but why didn't you sell? Because at the time I was convinced it was just a blip, continued Simon. But the entire thing unwound in just 3 days. I'd lost the lot. I was devastated. And Shelley, she was furious. I bet she was, replied Peter. I'm buying Bitcoin again, came the response from Simon. Peter was surprised by Simon's response. Let me explain. After the dust had settled, said Simon, I had this unquenchable thirst to find out where I'd gone wrong. I started reading books on Bitcoin, listening to more serious podcasts, and watching more videos. I educated myself on crypto and on Bitcoin. I found out that there is a world of difference between Bitcoin and all the rest. Please go on. I think this is exactly what I need to hear, said Peter, slightly excitedly. Let's see. How can I explain this simply? Said Simon thoughtfully. Behind all the other cryptos, and I mean all of them, there's a founder or a founding team. Some, like Ethereum for example, claim to be decentralized, but when you dig down, they're just not. Someone or some team is in charge. The protocol can be changed, the supply altered, and so on. Basically, they're vulnerable to manipulation and they're not truly anti-fragile. If you're into gambling and speculation, then go ahead. But if you want something secure for the future, then Bitcoin is the only game in town. There's a reason it makes up for more than half of the entire crypto space. I so wish I'd known all this earlier. Peter said, so Bitcoin can't be copied? Bitcoin has been copied already, hundreds of times, continued Simon. It's open source, so feel free to create your own version and tweak it with all the features you'd like to see. Peter felt confused. He didn't really understand what Simon was explaining. Simon recognized the confusion written across Peter's face and tried again. The power of Bitcoin is in the network. It's huge. It's in the miners, the nodes, the investors, and all the people who own and use Bitcoin. None of that can be replicated. Look, imagine you created a better version of Facebook. How easy would it be to overtake the real Facebook? Possible, right? That's because Facebook already has billions of users, brand recognition, advertisers, and investors. What I'm describing is known as network effect. This is what Bitcoin has in abundance, and that's why from now on, I'm only buying Bitcoin. Does Shelley know? Asked Peter, laughing. She's okay with it, but no more gambling on shitcoins. Peter thanked his friend for the chat and expressed his sorrow for his financial loss and made his way home. A few days later, Peter was at breakfast with Susan and their 14-year-old daughter, Katie. Peter ran a hand through his hair. I mentioned Bitcoin to the lads on Friday night. Susan raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what pray did those fonts of wisdom have to say? Dave thinks it's a bubble that's about to burst. Martin and Russ thinks it's all nonsense. They also said and told me that my old friend Simon had lost everything on crypto, said Peter, before walking Susan through the conversation that he had had with Simon. To be honest, said Susan, laughing, if your mates think it's a bad idea, it's probably a good sign rather than a bad one. Simon's story is unusual, especially the fact that he's still buying Bitcoin after all that's happened to him. Peter replied, the more I try to learn about it, the more I'm convinced that there are no shortcuts. It seems like you have to put in the work. Maybe it's because Bitcoin is so different to everything that's gone before. Susan nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps we're not going to make any progress talking to normal people. I mean, at the end of the day, they're all ignorant, just like we are. So Dave thinks we've missed the boat, eh? Let's find out if he's right. Katie, who'd been quietly listening to the chat, chimed in. Dad, why are you so interested in Bitcoin anyway? Peter smiled at his daughter. I'm just interested because it's new and most people seem to dismiss it. That alone is a reason to investigate. Things are getting more expensive, and your mum and I would love to go on holiday abroad and just do more fun things. We want to make sure we can enjoy life and provide a good future, for you too. Katie shrugged. I'd love that. One of the girls at school has a dad who's an expert on Bitcoin. The reason I know is because we were in a maths lesson and the teacher was asking why mathematics is so important. Tracy, the girl I was telling you about, put up her hand and said that her dad believes it's essential because Bitcoin relies on advanced mathematics and cryptography. Peter's eyes widened with interest. Really? Katie nodded enthusiastically. I can ask her to ask her dad if he would like to talk to you if you want. She's really nice. Susan leaned forward. Are we too late or not? That's what I want to know. If we are, we can just forget about the whole thing. Agreed, said Peter. Then turning back to Katie, he said, I'd also like to know. But rather than ask your friend, Katie, I think your mum and I will go back to the Bitcoin meetup and seek more clarification there. Chapter 7. Digital Property. Peter and Susan were excited to know more. Bitcoin Cafe was buzzing when they arrived. Emily spotted them as they entered and waved them over. Hi, nice to see you both again. How's the Bitcoin journey going? Peter smiled. It's going well, I think. We have a major question that we want to clear up. One of my mates told me that we'd missed the Bitcoin boat and that it no longer has any financial potential. Emily nodded. That old chestnut, eh? Let's find Tom. He's great at explaining why we're still pretty early. They found Tom sitting at a table alone, scrolling on his phone. Emily introduced Peter and Susan, and Tom greeted them warmly. So, you're interested in Bitcoin, but you're worried that you might be too late to the Bitcoin party, Tom said, leaning back in his chair. A common question indeed. Tom inhaled deeply and waited a few seconds before saying, First, you need to understand that Bitcoin is really about much more than just making money. It's about freedom, financial independence, and even about changing the world. He raised his hand in acknowledgement and continued. But it's okay, I get it. When we first discover Bitcoin, we think of its potential to make us richer. I've been in your shoes. So let's dive in and consider whether we're too late. He paused, looking intently at Peter and Susan. We're living in a digital world. Young people today are growing up where everything is digital. We're witnessing an AI revolution and we'll probably be seeing robo-taxis on the roads before long. Everything is becoming digital and it's accelerating. Think about it. In just over a decade, digitalization and mobile phones have effectively taken things from the material world and transformed them into a superior digital version. The list is huge and almost endless and includes maps, books, newspapers, music, video, notebooks, wallets, landline phones, letters, and even torches. Lots of things have been dematerialized by technology. Can you really imagine money remaining analog? We already use mobile phones with apps such as Apple Pay. It's hard to imagine us staying with cash. It would be like demanding the return of the horse and cart. In my opinion, the days of old ladies holding up the queues at the supermarket checkout while counting slowly the change are seriously numbered, he said, laughing. Peter and Susan exchanged thoughtful looks. True enough, Peter admitted. Like I said, continued Tom, Bitcoin is far more than just a way to increase your wealth. It's a revolution, it's hope, and it's a force for peace in the world. But for now, let's continue and consider its potential as a store of value. By that I mean is how Bitcoin can be used to preserve wealth and protect against inflation. Like owning property, said Peter. Precisely, Tom replied. One of the best indicators of Bitcoin's future potential in this role is the market value of other assets that already are used to preserve wealth. So, for instance, the market capitalization of gold. All that means is the total market value of gold, which is currently around $15.5 trillion. The current total market capitalization of Bitcoin, by comparison, is less than 1.5 trillion, meaning that the market values gold 10 times higher than it does Bitcoin. But it also means that if Bitcoin continues to grow and catches up with gold, the dollar value of Bitcoin would be 10 times higher than it is today. Are you saying that the price of Bitcoin is going to increase 10 times from here? Asked Susan. Hold on to your hat, said Tom. We're just getting started. The next way in which people store their wealth is real estate. Real estate is a huge market, valued at over $280 trillion worldwide. That's nearly 20 times the market cap of gold. Now, imagine if even a small fraction of the wealth stored in real estate were to flow into Bitcoin. We're talking about a significant increase in Bitcoin's market value. Peter looked like he'd just had a major revelation. It's already happening. A man and his wife on my post round sold their house to buy Bitcoin. That's how we got interested in the first place. There you go, said Tom. But there's more. Next is the bond market, which is valued at over $100 trillion. Bonds, effectively, are government debt. When you buy bonds, you're lending money to the government. Because it's highly unlikely that the government will go broke, they're seen as a very safe investment. But the return is absolutely pitiful. However, governments around the world are creating more and more debt, especially since all the COVID responses. Bitcoin, with its fixed supply and decentralized nature, is becoming an attractive option. Susan leaned in, her curiosity getting the better of her. So what you're saying is that there is still a very long way to go. Tom replied, put it like this. When you ask a random person in the street what they think about Bitcoin, what do they say? Susan thought for a moment and said, no idea, it's risky, maybe it'll get banned, or something like, well, maybe it's used by criminals. Tom replied, that's right. Most people have no idea what Bitcoin is, what it's for, how it works, and why we would even need it. They are clueless. And it's not just the public. Most of the media, traditional banking, politicians, and leaders of our institutions are also baffled. But here's the thing. In its first 10 years, the adoption rate of Bitcoin has been much faster than the internet. By 2019, the number of Bitcoin users had reached 35 million, or more than double the number of users of the internet in its first 10 years. Another important development is that Bitcoin arrived on Wall Street in 2024. The American authorities approved a Bitcoin ETF, or Exchange Traded Fund. This means that now institutions, pension funds, corporations, businesses, and even private individuals can buy Bitcoin as part of their investment strategy. Other countries have followed suit, such as Hong Kong, the UK, Canada, and Australia. ETFs have existed for over 30 years. The Bitcoin ETF has only just been launched, and it's already the most successful ETF in history. Okay, look, there's more I could say, but I think you get the picture, finished Tom with a confident laugh. After a short moment of silence, Susan said, so how much does Bitcoin cost? Tom glanced quickly at his phone and replied, $70,000 or £54,000 if you prefer. For how many? Asked Peter. One, replied Tom. Peter looked a little shocked. My mate said that in the pub, and I thought he was joking, came Peter's response. It sounds like it's only for rich people to me. Tom reassured Peter and Susan by saying, look, each Bitcoin is made up of 100 million Satoshis, so anyone can buy as much or as little as they want. You can buy a part of a Bitcoin for £10 or thousands of pounds. Everyone can take part, regardless of their budget. So, said Tom, leaning back into his chair with a smile on his face, are you still worried about being late? Susan and Peter were trying to mentally process everything that Tom had just told them. Wow, just wow, uttered Peter. If everything we've learned so far is true, this is a far bigger opportunity than I imagined. The other evening I did some mental arithmetics. I was thinking about the supply cap of 21 million compared to all the people who might want to buy some Bitcoin someday in the future. Those numbers alone were startling, so when combined with all the things you just told us, it's unimaginable. I think I need another beer. Can I get you one too, Tom? Pete and Susan left the Bitcoin cafe and made their way home, deep in thought, but one step further. Chapter 9. Peter had enjoyed a happy childhood in Peckham, London, during the 1970s. His dad had worked as a plumber, and his mother had contributed vital money to the family budget by working part-time, cleaning. Despite all their hard work, money was always tight. Like most kids from the 70s, Peter had grown up with plenty of freedom. The streets and the parks of Peckham were his playground, where he and his friends would create their own adventures, free from the constant supervision that most children encounter today. However, the financial strain was a constant undercurrent in Peter's family life. His parents argued about money frequently, with little spare, even for simple luxuries. This financial pressure stemmed from the mortgage that his parents had taken on at around the time of his birth. While their house was in a nice neighbourhood, and they even had a garden, they had taken on more debt than they could afford. Peter often heard bits of their conversations, worries about bills and mortgage payments that cast a shadow over those otherwise carefree days. He understood from an early age that money was a source of stress and conflict. As Peter grew older, he became aware of the scarcity mindset that had permeated his upbringing. He noticed how it had affected his own approach to money and opportunities. He was cautious, often choosing security over risk, and this cautiousness had influenced many of his life decisions, including his career as a postman. Despite these ingrained habits, Peter had always been curious and keen to learn. He often listened to audiobooks, especially those on self-improvement and psychology. Over the years, he had finished many books on the topic of the subconscious mind and how we all basically manifest what we believe. Authors like Napoleon Hill and Brian Tracy became his companions, teaching him about the power of positive thinking and the law of attraction. Peter began to understand how his parents' constant worry about money had shaped his own beliefs. He realised that he too had adopted a scarcity mindset, always expecting the worst and rarely daring to dream big. This realisation was both enlightening and disheartening at the same time. It explains so much about his cautious nature and his reluctance to take risks. He knew that abundance was the true nature of the world. In nature, everything is abundant. Chapter 8. Is it robust? As Peter made his way down the familiar streets, he arrived at the house on Forest Avenue, where the man had sold his property to buy Bitcoin. The sold sign was still there, but now the house stood empty, waiting for its new occupants. Peter paused, his thoughts drifting back to his recent conversations with David, Emily, and Tom. Maybe we could do the same, he thought, a flicker of excitement stirring within him. It was the first time the thought had entered his head. But the thought had entered, and thoughts, as he strongly believed, can become reality. He and Susan had been struggling to make ends meet, and the idea of securing their financial future was very tempting. But then he caught himself, shaking his head. "Get a grip, Peter, you're living in the real world, not some fantasy land." He continued his route, but the questions gnawed at him. We still don't know how Bitcoin works. I mean, will it last? Can it be destroyed or hacked? And how robust is it really? The uncertainty weighed heavily on his mind. That evening, Peter, Susan and Katie attended Katie's parents' evening at school. The school was awash with activity, parents and teachers engaging in earnest conversations about their child's progress. The corridors were filled with the hum of chatter, the squeak of shoes on the polished floors, and the occasional laughter as old friends and acquaintances reconnected. Katie led them through the halls as she pointed out her classroom and introduced her teachers. As they moved from one meeting to the next, discussing Katie's strengths and areas for improvement, Katie suddenly stopped and pointed. "Look, Dad, there's Tracy and her parents," she exclaimed. Peter and Susan turned to see a friendly-looking couple chatting with a teacher. "Hi, Tracy," Katie called out, waving. Tracy waved back and nudged her parents, who looked up and smiled. After a few more minutes of polite conversation with the teacher, Tracy's family made their way over. "Hi, you must be Peter and Susan," Tracy's father, Mark, said, extending his hand. "I'm Mark, and this is my wife, Lisa. Tracy has told us so much about Katie." "It's nice to meet you," Peter replied, shaking hands. "Katie's mentioned you too, that you're quite knowledgeable about Bitcoin. We've recently started looking into it ourselves, but we've still got lots of questions and concerns." Lisa smiled warmly. "Nice to hear that we're not the only ones. Sometimes it feels like we're total outliers." Mark loves nothing more than to talk about Bitcoin. It's his favourite topic. "How about coming back to our place after this? I have a very nice bottle of dry white wine in the fridge." Peter and Susan exchanged glances and nodded. "That sounds great," Susan said. "We have loads of questions." Peter, Susan and Katie followed Mark's car and eventually parked outside a lovely Victorian terraced house that was well kept. Peter was keen on this type of house with its high ceilings and solid appearance. Inside was equally impressive. It was a lovely place. "Mark, I'm curious," Peter began. "How did you get into Bitcoin in the first place?" Mark smiled, clearly enjoying the chance to share his story. "I've always been fascinated by computers and tech. I used to be that geek in the corner of the classroom reading the latest coding magazine." Peter and Susan listened intently, intrigued by the personal angle. "One day, I stumbled upon an article about Bitcoin," Mark continued. "At first, I was skeptical. It sounded too good to be true. A decentralized currency that wasn't controlled by any government or corporation. But the more I read, the more fascinated I became. I started to understand the technology behind it, the blockchain, and how it solved so many issues inherent in our current financial system." Lisa chimed in. "I remember those days. Mark was practically obsessed. He spent hours reading, watching videos and participating in online forums. It was like he discovered a whole new world." Mark nodded. "Exactly. But the real turning point came when I attended my first Bitcoin conference. I met people from all walks of life who were passionate about this technology, just like I was. There were developers, investors, activists, all united by a common belief that Bitcoin could change the world. It was incredibly inspiring." Peter leaned forward, clearly interested. So, what convinced you to finally invest? Mark took a sip of his drink. It was a combination of things, seeing the dedication and intelligence of the people involved, understanding the security and potential of the technology, and witnessing the growing adoption worldwide. But to be honest, I think it was the technology. I loved it. It was incredible, almost a miracle. Susan's eyes widened. So, it's impressive from a technical perspective. Mark smiled. Very. You said you wanted to know about Bitcoin security, right? Yes, said Peter, but I'm also interested in how it works, whether it will last, and if it will be destroyed or hacked. Basically, is it robust? To understand how Bitcoin functions on a technical level, I'd say you're better reading books or researching on the internet. Bitcoin is the result of decades of work. Lots of attempts have been made previously at solving the main problem, but none of them ever succeeded, replied Mark. What problem? Asked Susan. Mark replied, how to prevent people from spending the same digital money twice or multiple times without the need to trust a central authority, such as a bank. The problem is that anything in digital format can be easily duplicated. It took years and years of work to refine a system that prevented fraud and counterfeiting in a totally decentralized way. This might be a stupid question, but what's wrong with trusting a bank or other regulated institution? Asked Susan. It's true. From our perspective here in the UK or other rich nation, it might sound like an odd goal to pursue, Mark said. But in countries such as Venezuela and Argentina, where millions of people lost most of their savings overnight because of a corrupt government decision, which was supported by the banks, it's a very big deal indeed. Bitcoin is money that cannot be tampered with, devalued, or printed to infinity. And critically, you don't need to ask permission or get approval to send or transfer your money. And don't forget, there are 1.5 billion people in the world who cannot get a bank account. Basically, regardless of where you live in the world, you can spend your money whenever you want, on whatever you want, with whomever you want. But is Bitcoin here to stay? Will it break? Asked Peter. Mark leaned back, ready to dive into his favourite metaphor. All right, let's start simple. Bitcoin is the most secure computer network in the world. Peter raised an eyebrow. Really? How can you be so sure? Think about it, Mark said, his eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. Bitcoin has been running since 2009 without a single successful hack of its core protocol. It's maintained by thousands of independent nodes spread across the globe. This decentralization makes it incredibly resilient to attacks. Susan leaned in, clearly interested. Can you explain that in simpler terms? Of course, Mark said. Imagine you're building a tower out of Lego bricks. Each brick represents a transaction. And every time you add a new brick, it's locked in place with a special, unique code. This code connects it to the brick below, forming a chain. Peter and Susan nodded, visualizing the Lego tower in their minds. Now, Mark continued, imagine that there are thousands of people all around the world building identical Lego towers at the same time. Each time someone adds a new brick, everybody else checks to make it sure it fits perfectly with the previous bricks. If it does, they all add the same brick to their towers. If it doesn't, they reject it. Susan was clearly interested. So everyone's building and checking at the same time. Exactly, Mark said. This is like the blockchain. Each block is a group of transactions, and they're all linked together with a unique code called a hash. The thousands of people are the nodes in the Bitcoin network, and they all have a copy of the blockchain. When a new block is added, they verify it by solving a complex mathematical puzzle. But what if somebody tries to cheat and change a brick in the middle of the tower? Peter asked. Good question, Mark replied. If someone tries to change a brick, the unique code for that brick changes, and so do all the codes for the bricks above it. It becomes obvious to everyone else that something's wrong, and they reject the entire tower. It's like trying to change one piece in a complicated jigsaw puzzle without anyone noticing. Susan nodded slowly. So it's really hard to change anything once it's been added. That's right, Mark said. This makes Bitcoin incredibly secure. The blockchain is immutable, meaning that once a transaction is recorded, it can't be altered or delayed. And because there are so many nodes verifying each transaction, it's impossible for anyone to tamper with it. Peter seemed thoughtful. But what about hacking? Can't somebody just hack into the system? Another good question, said Mark. Hacking the entire Bitcoin network would require someone to take control of more than 50% of the nodes simultaneously, which is practically impossible given the size and the distributed nature of the network. It's like trying to hack into every computer in the world at the same time. Individual users need to be careful with their own security, like making sure they use a strong password and keeping their private keys safe, but the network itself is extremely robust. Lisa added, think of it like this. Bitcoin is like a digital fortress with millions of guards. Even if a few guards are distracted, the fortress remains secure because the majority are always on the lookout. Then Mark asked Peter, I'm curious, what makes you so interested in Bitcoin? Do you have some money to invest? No, said Peter, shaking his head. It's not that we have a lot of money to invest. In fact, quite the opposite. We're trying to find a way to survive financially. To be honest, things are getting more and more expensive every day, and it feels like we're barely keeping our heads above water. We're looking for a way to protect what little we have, and maybe even to grow it. Susan nodded in agreement. We've been thinking a lot about our future and Katie's future. We want to make sure we can provide for her and maybe even enjoy life a bit more ourselves. The idea of Bitcoin is just so intriguing, but yeah, there are so many questions. Mark leaned back. I see. So the guy who sold his house and went all in on Bitcoin has got you thinking. I bet you there's a voice in the back of your head saying, if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. Am I right? Peter replied like a shot. Absolutely. I think we're risk averse. Mark nodded in agreement. As humans, we're wired to be risk averse. It's a basic survival instinct. Our brains are designed to protect us from danger, and taking risks often feels like stepping into the unknown, which can be very scary. But the reality is, progress often requires taking calculated risks. Susan said, How do you mean exactly? Well, Mark continued, there's a concept in psychology called loss aversion. It means people tend to fear losses more than they value gains. For example, losing £100 feels much worse than the pleasure of gaining £100. This makes people more likely to avoid risks, even when the potential benefits are significant. Peter nodded. So how do we overcome that instinct? One way is through education and understanding, Mark explained. The more you know about an opportunity, the less risky it feels. By learning about Bitcoin and understanding its technology, you're reducing the unknowns, which makes it feel less like a gamble and more like a calculated decision. Another way is to start small. As I mentioned earlier, by investing a small amount, you can get comfortable with the idea and then gradually increase your investment as your confidence grows. Peter and Susan both smiled, feeling more reassured. That's really helpful, Mark. Thanks for explaining it so simply, Peter said. Any time, Mark said with a grin on his face. To overcoming fears and making informed decisions. They all clinked their glasses again, feeling a sense of camaraderie and a shared purpose. Chapter 10. Walk by the river. Peter and Susan often took a leisurely walk along the River Thames from Richmond to Kew Gardens. The day was clear and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers. As they strolled past famous landmarks like the Richmond Bridge and the Syon House, they talked about the last couple of weeks. I was just thinking, Peter began, breaking the comfortable silence. It was the man who had sold his house to buy into Bitcoin that got us started on this journey. Do you think it'd be a good idea if we just recap where we are and what we've learned? I don't know about you, but my head's been spinning for the last couple of weeks. Susan nodded. Good idea. Well, for me, I remember when you first told me, I remember thinking how radical it seemed. But at the same time, I remember being curious. They continued walking, the path winding gently along the river. Then we met David at the bowling green, Peter said. He told us how broken our current financial system is and how the government is addicted to money printing, which devalues our savings and causes price inflation. Susan sighed. Yeah, I remember that. That was depressing. To discover that our hard-earned money constantly loses value just because of the actions taken by some faceless bureaucrat and those in power. I still can't get over the £420 billion that somehow got spent on COVID and that it was all created at the click of a button. Just imagine how many thousands of years it would take us to earn £420 billion. Peter pulled out his mobile phone. Let's find out, he said jokingly. Let's have a look how long it would take. So, let's say we earn £2,000 per month after tax. That means, brace yourself, it would take us 17.5 million years to earn £420 billion. Wow. Pity we don't have a money printing machine just like the government does. Okay, said Peter, back to our recap. Then there was the man who bought the empty property as an investment. It's also crazy, isn't it, to think that there are hundreds of thousands of properties just standing empty while so many people struggle to afford a home. Susan added, and then there was our first visit to the Bitcoin Cafe, where we learnt about what makes Bitcoin so special, its limited supply, and the fact that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. To be honest, that was my biggest light bulb moment so far. The scarcity thing really got me. Peter smiled. True. And then there was the chat with my mates. Their response was, well, negative to put it mildly, but it helped us to realise how little most people know about the topic. They paused to watch the boats drifting lazily along the river. Then there was our second visit to the Bitcoin Cafe with Tom. That was an important one for me, Susan continued. We found out why it's most likely not too late to start buying Bitcoin. That conversation really helped put things into perspective. Peter nodded thoughtfully. And don't forget about last night when we found out how secure Bitcoin is. We found out that it's one of the most secure computer networks in the world. It's resistant to hacking, even from governments. They walked in silence for a few moments, each lost in their thoughts. The path began to open up, revealing the lush greenery of Kew Gardens in the distance. Peter took a deep breath. You know, I've been thinking about the man who sold his house to buy Bitcoin. What if that could be an option for us? Susan looked at him, her expression a mix of surprise and contemplation. You mean you started to secretly plan to sell our house and buy Bitcoin? She laughed. Peter laughed too. No, it's just that the thought popped into my mind. Thanks for that. Not sure what to make of it though, said Susan. Look, I've been surprised about my own feelings towards it. I can't help thinking that it might be an opportunity. Perhaps it's the response to the COVID madness that's made me far more open and critical. During COVID, it seemed like everyone, apart from us, was in panic and just following the crowd. There was even a mad scramble for toilet paper, for God's sake. Do you remember that? It made me realise that people feel safe in crowds. If the crowd is doing it and the BBC is in approval, somehow it's fine. Peter said, most people are terrified of doing anything that's outside of received wisdom. Anyway, said Peter, where does that leave us? Susan said, let's just buy some. Just a little. Just let's buy a little Bitcoin and just find out how it works. Tom told us that we can just buy £10 worth. We could just dabble a little and see what happens. What do you say? Excellent idea. Let's find out if we're savvy enough to buy some, said Peter. Chapter 11. Buying some Bitcoin. Sunday morning, Peter and Susan were sitting at the kitchen table, mobile phones and laptops at the ready, prepared to buy some Bitcoin. Peter had spent the previous evening trying to find out how he and Susan could buy Bitcoin. He'd discovered a great deal. Firstly, that there are a number of ways to buy Bitcoin, each with different advantages and disadvantages. For Peter and Susan, the easiest method was to just go to their bank and instruct the bank to buy a Bitcoin ETF. ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund, and it's as easy to purchase as buying shares in a listed company. The next easiest method was perhaps a little bit more complicated, but would give them the feeling that they actually owned Bitcoin itself. Here they would download an app to their phone and buy Bitcoin on an exchange. They would need to transfer pounds to the Bitcoin exchange and then exchange that money for its equivalent in Bitcoin. But Peter had found out that the most secure method was to buy Bitcoin on an exchange, as mentioned before, but then to transfer the keys for that Bitcoin to a so-called cold wallet. This method would give Peter total control and responsibility for his Bitcoin. Peter looked up from his laptop. Because we're beginners, I think the best method for us is to download an app and keep our Bitcoin on there. I've looked at a few, but Strike seems to be the best one because it's Bitcoin only, which is basically what we want. It's only a test, so we're only going to spend £30. We can always use a different service later if we want to. Susan nodded, jotting down notes. She downloaded the app to her mobile and entered her details and required information. That's a pain, said Susan. We have to wait 24 hours before we can start using the app. Apparently a requirement of the UK government. Oh, okay. Until tomorrow then, said Peter. Monday evening and they were back. Peter had been doing some research. He now knew that he could transfer £30 from their bank account to the Strike app. Then they had the option of exchanging the £30 for its equivalent in Bitcoin. Access to the Bitcoin would then only be possible through the Strike app, which provides a wallet interface to manage his Bitcoin. The app would allow them to send Bitcoin to someone else or exchange it back into pounds when desired. Peter and Susan exchanged a glance, feeling the anticipation build. "Let's do it," Peter said, his voice steady but filled with excitement. Susan nodded and initiated the transfer of £30 from their bank account to the Strike app. The process was smooth, and within minutes the funds were available in their Strike account. They watched as the screen displayed the fluctuating Bitcoin price. "Okay," Susan said, her finger hovering over the button. "Here we go. £30 into Bitcoin." Peter leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Click it." Susan tapped the button, and within seconds their pounds were converted into Bitcoin. They both let out a sigh of relief. "That was easier than I thought," Susan said, a smile spreading across her face. "Now we own Bitcoin," Peter said, the reality of their purchase sinking in. "So, what next?" Susan asked. "Well, for now we'll keep it on the Strike app," Peter replied. "But there's an option to transfer it to a cold wallet, which is, as I've read, the most secure way to store Bitcoin. But I say we look into that later if we decide to invest more." Over the next few days, Peter continued to research Bitcoin and the best ways to store it securely. Later, he brought up the topic again. "I've been reading more about cold wallets," Peter said. It's like this. It's like having a safe for your Bitcoin. The Trezor wallet seems to be the most recommended." Susan looked thoughtful. "You think it's worth getting one now?" "Maybe not right away," Peter said, "but it's good to know that option is there if we decide to invest more significantly." They both felt a sense of accomplishment. They'd taken their first step into the world of Bitcoin, and it had been surprisingly easy. As they continued their journey, they knew they would keep learning and adapting. "Learning something new every day," Peter said with a grin. "Absolutely," Susan agreed. "And today, we learned how to buy Bitcoin." Chapter 12. Traditional Finance. The following week, Peter and Susan found themselves again in the kitchen. The latest letter from the bank about their mortgage spread out in front of them. Susan's face was pale as she read the details. "It's the third time in 2 years," Peter said, rubbing his templates. "I can't believe they're putting up our monthly payments again. This is exactly what you get by printing billions of pounds to pay people to stay at home doing nothing." Susan sighed, looking at the figures. "It feels like we'll never get ahead. I think we still owe around £250,000, and we have 20-odd years left to pay it off." Peter nodded. "And don't forget the roof needs fixing. That's going to cost a fortune." Susan put the letter down. "We can't keep going like this. It's interesting that we've both been excited about Bitcoin. It's like our subconscious minds already know that we are in a bit of a financial pickle, and they are working to find a solution for us. But is Bitcoin really a solution? It still seems so radical, even though we know so much more." Whenever Peter and Susan faced financial difficulties in the past, they had turned to their old friend, Steve. He was an experienced financial advisor, but more importantly, he used to play football with Peter when he was younger, and it was Steve who had recommended that they remortgage their house just a few years ago. The weather forecast was good for Sunday afternoon, so they arranged to meet for lunch at their favourite cafe with views of the River Thames and the Houses of Parliament. Peter and Susan explained their situation, detailing the rising mortgage payments, the cost of fixing the roof, and their concerns about the future. Steve listened intently, nodding thoughtfully. "That's tough, but there are proven methods to address this. Look, basically, your mortgage is a weight around your neck. You could consider downsizing, selling your house and moving to a smaller, more affordable place, maybe even in a different part of the country. That would really free up significant capital and reduce your monthly expenses. Peter looked at Susan and then back at Steve. What's your opinion on Bitcoin? We've been looking into it after a man on my postal round sold his house to buy it. Steve's expression changed to a mixture of surprise and concern. Bitcoin? Peter? Susan? I strongly advise against it. Bitcoin is incredibly volatile and speculative. It's not backed by anything tangible. Basically, you're just gambling. I had a client 20 years ago during the dot-com bubble. He invested heavily in internet stocks because everyone was saying they were the future. He lost everything when the bubble burst. It took him years to recover. Bitcoin just reminds me of that frenzy. People are getting caught up in the hype without understanding the risks. Susan frowned. But what about its security and decentralization? Steve shrugged. Maybe it's secure for now, but technology evolves. What happens if some supercomputer comes along that could break its encryption in the future? And what about the government banning it? Governments and central banks will take any action necessary to protect their monopoly on the money supply. Plus, there are newer digital currencies being developed. Bitcoin could just become obsolete. My advice is to stick with traditional investments that have a proven track record. Peter felt his enthusiasm waning. I appreciate your honesty, Steve. Susan noticed his disappointment and asked, Do you know anything about Bitcoin, Steve? Steve replied, a little too defensively, What I've read in the media and seen on TV. Then Steve smiled reassuringly. Look, I know it's tempting to look for quick gains, but financial stability comes from making smart, informed decisions. Peter felt deflated. Even though he knew at some level that Steve had probably not done any work or any research into Bitcoin, he couldn't help but wonder if he was right. After all, he and Susan didn't know anybody personally who had bought Bitcoin, let alone sell their house to buy it. Maybe Susan and he were just in fantasy land and needed to return to their old and familiar reality quickly and just be like everybody else. But what if Bitcoin is a smart, informed decision? Susan replied to Steve. It's not, said Steve. Just the other day, the governor of the Bank of England warned against Bitcoin, saying that people should be prepared to lose all their money. He would say that, wouldn't he? Said Susan. Steve leaned forward, his tone patient but firm. Susan, think of it this way. Imagine you're on a well-trodden path in the forest. It's safe and familiar, but you hear about a new shortcut that promises you to get out of the forest quicker. The guide advises everyone to stick to the familiar path because it's been used for years and it's well understood. Sure, the shortcut might get you out faster, but it's risky and it's uncharted. The familiar path, despite being longer, is the safer bet. That's what the Bank of England is saying. Stick to what's proven and stable. Peter and Susan exchanged uneasy glances. Steve continued, Look, I know it's tempting to look for quick gains, but financial stability comes from making smart, informed decisions. If you need help with a detailed plan, I'm here for you. Back home, Peter and Susan sat in silence, processing everything they'd heard. Susan was the first to speak. Steve's points are hard to ignore. Maybe we're getting in over our heads. Peter nodded. I'm starting to think maybe he's right. maybe Bitcoin is too risky. I mean, we can't afford to make a mistake. Susan sighed. Okay, so maybe I should take on more hours at work. I could go full time. They're always asking me. Peter leaned back, feeling the weight of their situation. He didn't want Susan to be working full time. At the moment, she had a good work-life balance, and she was happy with things. And in addition, he'd always seen it as his job to support his wife and family financially. Not so fast, said Peter. We still have a few weeks. Let's just think everything through. Susan agreed reluctantly. All right, let's take a step back and reassess. Chapter 13. Freedom. Before starting his round each morning, Peter went to the sorting office to organise his round. Over the years, Peter had seen many colleagues come and go, but very few had stuck it out for as long as he had. One of the few exceptions was Mick. Mick was a very friendly man in his late 50s, but also a man of very few words. He kept himself to himself, arriving, organising what he needed, and then just disappearing again. He wasn't one for socialising, and on the odd occasions when colleagues would meet up for a party or other event, Mick was almost never present. Peter had a great deal of respect for Mick, especially after the COVID episode. During the pandemic, the post office had required everyone to wear a mask while in the sorting office. Mick had refused. Peter remembered colleagues urging Mick to wear a mask. Mick's reply was always the same. I don't wear a mask. When pressed and pressured into explaining why, Mick never engaged and just replied with the same mantra. He had been summoned to the manager's office on several occasions and told that it was absolutely mandatory, but Mick refused to back down. Peter remembered telling Mick that he was playing a dangerous game and that he might end up even losing his job. Mick told Peter that what will be, but that he just didn't wear a mask. Interestingly, as the weeks went by, more and more people started to join Mick in his silent protest. They'd probably been emboldened since Mick had not been fired, for now at least. By the time the mask requirement was officially lifted, nearly a third of the workers had joined Mick in his refusal to wear a mask. Peter was in the sorting office a few days after his meeting with Steve when he noticed Mick fiddling around on his phone. Mick was rarely seen using technology, so this piqued Peter's curiosity. Everything all right, Mick? Peter asked. Mick looked up and gave a smile. Just checking the Bitcoin price. Peter's eyes widened. Bitcoin? You're into Bitcoin? Mick nodded. Been into it for a few years now. It's my little retirement plan, I hope. I almost have a full Bitcoin. Peter was stunned. Mick, the most unlikely tech enthusiast, was into Bitcoin. Wow, I never would have guessed. What made you get into it? Mick shrugged. Are you sure you want to know? Peter was surprised. He could sense that Mick's reason for getting into Bitcoin might be something that Peter didn't want to hear. I think I can handle it, laughed Peter. Okay, said Mick. The Canadian truckers having their assets frozen and seized by the government during the COVID hysteria. It was a wake-up call for me. All around us our freedoms were being taken away and nobody seemed to care. When I saw the government in Canada freezing bank accounts for protesting, I got worried. Peter raised an eyebrow. The truckers' protest? I didn't hear about that. What was it? Mick had a resigned expression. Truck drivers in Canada drove to Ottawa to protest vaccine mandates and other COVID restrictions. They blocked roads and created disruption. It was one of the biggest protests in Canadian history. Peter listened intently as Mick continued. The Canadian government responded by declaring a state of emergency, and they took drastic measures. They froze the bank accounts of the protest organisers and even threatened to seize their assets. It was so unfair and a brutal crackdown. All of my life I had believed in democracy, the institutions, and above all, freedom. But it seemed like all of that had been turned on its head. What's worse, the majority of the Canadian people were in favour of the government's actions. It made me realise that people are not really interested in freedom at all. They want security and someone to tell them what to do. Those truckers were just ordinary people standing up for what they believed in, and the government tried to crush them financially. Peter replied, maybe that's a bit strong. Maybe, said Mick, but it's how I felt at the time. Anyway, that's when I started getting interested in Bitcoin. I found out that it belongs to no one and everyone. No single entity or government can control it. I saw it as a way to protect myself from all the tyranny that was going on around me. Peter was taken aback by Mick's passion. I had no idea you felt so strongly about it, Mick sighed. It's not just about feeling strongly, it's about being prepared. So, are you still buying Bitcoin? Asked Peter. Since 2020, every spare pound that I get, I put into Bitcoin. I've learned so much and it feels so right. Of course, I keep it to myself. Everyone in here already thinks I'm a conspiracy theorist, so I don't want to give them any encouragement by telling them that I buy Bitcoin as well, he said, laughing. Peter replied, I can relate to that. As a matter of fact, we've been looking into Bitcoin ourselves. Peter told Mick about the man he'd bumped into on his round who'd sold his house for Bitcoin. Then, to Peter's surprise, Mick said, My brother did the same thing. He sold his house in the Canary Islands, moved to Portugal, and bought Bitcoin with the proceeds. Peter had not been expecting that. Really? You're not pulling my leg? Nope, replied Mick. It's true. He was sick and tired of paying tax every time he bought or sold a house. He was sick of mortgages and banks, and he was sick of not having the flexibility and freedom that he wanted. He thinks that Bitcoin is the perfect property. He's in Portugal, so there's no tax when you buy Bitcoin, no maintenance cost, no council taxes, and there's no taxes when you sell it. He did it about a year ago, and he's already doubled his money. No way, said Peter. Is your brother a massive risk taker then? Not really, replied Mick. He spent thousands of hours, I think, researching it before diving in. I think he made a good decision. Time will tell. Look, he continued, I've got to get these letters posted. Tell you what, feel free to tap me on the shoulder any time. If you think I can help, just let me know. Just quickly, said Peter. My wife and I have been looking into it, but we're still on the fence. We're even thinking about buying a Trezor wallet to store any substantial amounts of Bitcoin we might buy. Mick's eyes lit up. Smart. Keeping your Bitcoin off exchanges and in a hardware wallet is the best way to ensure its security. Peter hesitated for a moment before asking, Do you ever worry about the risks? About the possibility of losing everything? Mick shook his head. Look, every investment has risks, Peter. But the biggest risk is not doing anything and sticking with a broken system. The world's changing. More money is being printed than ever before, and I'd rather be prepared. Mick grinned. Look, do your homework. It's not about the price. It's about understanding why it matters. Once you get that, the rest all falls into place. I'll tell you what, one last tip. If you're searching for real inspiration, look into a company called MicroStrategy and its founder, Michael Saylor. Peter nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. Chapter 14. Michael Saylor. Listening and learning from podcasts was one of Peter's favourite activities while he was delivering the post. Mick had suggested looking into MicroStrategy and its founder, Michael Saylor. Peter quickly found a podcast called What Bitcoin Did. He inserted his earpods and started to listen to the fascinating story of Michael Saylor and the way he was revolutionizing the way large corporations structure their treasury assets with the help of Bitcoin in the USA. Michael Saylor is the executive chairman and co-founder of MicroStrategy, a company that provides business intelligence, mobile software, and cloud-based services. His net worth is estimated at $4.2 billion. In early 2020, as the COVID policy response began, Saylor was worried about the future of his company. He began to think hard about the options for its future and for its cash reserves. MicroStrategy is listed as a public company on the New York Stock Exchange. Wall Street only rewards companies that can constantly increase their profits. Over the previous 10 years, however, Saylor and his team at MicroStrategy had tried everything they could think of to generate a growth rate of over 7% a year. They'd invested in people, sales, and much more, but it had all failed. His company, however, generated profits and held $500 million in cash. Wall Street didn't value cash. They even had a saying, cash is trash. And inflation was eating away at its value. Saylor began to search for an asset in which he could invest the company's cash and which could generate a good return for its investors. Saylor stumbled across Bitcoin, and not for the first time. Ironically, in 2013, he'd famously tweeted on Twitter, "Bitcoin days are numbered. It seems like just a matter of time before it suffers the same fate as online gambling." After deciding to take a fresh look at Bitcoin and dedicating hundreds of hours into understanding it better, Saylor realized that it would make the perfect treasury reserve asset for MicroStrategy. He instructed his board of directors also to study Bitcoin, just as he had done. After giving his shareholders due notice and an opportunity to sell their shares at a very fair price, MicroStrategy went ahead and purchased Bitcoin for a massive $250 million. But that was only the beginning. The company began taking out loans and issuing more shares to buy even more Bitcoin. Since 2020, MicroStrategy has spent $7.5 billion on buying Bitcoin and now holds 226,000 Bitcoin. The market value of MicroStrategy has gone from $1 billion in 2020 to $30 billion in 2024. Peter paused the podcast for a moment and reflected on what he'd just heard. So basically, without growing the core business in any way at all, without producing more, without selling more services or products, MicroStrategy had gone from a business with a value of $1 billion to $30 billion in just 4 years. And they had done it by simply buying and holding Bitcoin. Peter felt a wave of curiosity wash over him. He'd always been skeptical of Bitcoin, but hearing Saylor's articulate and confident voice sparked new interest. As Saylor detailed MicroStrategy's initial move to invest $250 million into Bitcoin, Peter's own skepticism began to wane. The audacity and foresight of Saylor's decision was inspirational. In addition, Peter was struck by Saylor's unwavering faith in Bitcoin's security, decentralized nature, and the belief that it was the future of money. Saylor's business now held over 226,000 Bitcoin, and its objective was to continue to acquire as much as possible at any price and to never sell. Now that's impressive, Peter said out loud to himself. Manhattan is one of Saylor's favorite Bitcoin metaphors. Saylor believes that owning Bitcoin is akin to owning a piece of Manhattan in cyberspace. Because Bitcoin is extraordinarily scarce and indestructible, It has the same characteristics in cyberspace as Manhattan has in the material world. The opportunity that we currently have with Bitcoin is comparable to the opportunity that people had to buy land in Manhattan in the 1700s. According to Seiler, buying in Manhattan in the 1600s would have been preferable, but if you bought in the 1700s, it would have been a very good investment. The same applies for the 1800s, the 1900s, and even today. Buying land in Manhattan will never be a poor investment because it's the most sought-after real estate in the world, built on solid granite in the world's greatest city. Seiler also believes strongly that unless you have put at least 100 hours into understanding Bitcoin and all the problems it can solve, you just shouldn't invest. Bitcoin is a paradigm shift. It's going to be the bedrock of the digital world, but it's not intuitive. We need to overcome decades of programming and completely understand what money is. Peter couldn't help but admire Seiler's vision and determination. The idea that Bitcoin could be a strategic financial safeguard, not just a speculative investment, resonated deeply with him. He felt a growing sense of urgency, a need to act before it was too late. Peter imagined the possibilities for his own financial future and the security it could bring to his family. By the end of the podcast, Peter was convinced that he needed to look even deeper into Bitcoin. Inspired by Seiler's journey, he felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. He took off his headphones, his mind buzzing with new ideas and a clear direction for his next steps. Chapter 15. The Housing Ladder. The more he learned, the more he needed to learn. For Peter, Bitcoin was like a never-ending journey of discovery. While it was uncomfortable, he was enjoying it. He thought back to his parents and grandparents. In those days, people had married young and started a family immediately. Many had managed to save up enough for a small deposit and get a mortgage from the bank or building society for a home. Incredibly, these young families had even found it possible to get by on just one wage. How the world had changed, he thought. For most young people today, saving enough for a deposit and getting a mortgage for a house was totally out of reach. Even when both partners in a relationship were earning, owning a house and getting on the property ladder was unachievable. Peter recalled his conversation with David and all that he had told them about how money came into existence. He remembered that our system of fractional reserve banking effectively meant that banks could create money out of thin air. When a bank agrees to loan someone money for a mortgage, that money previously did not exist. It's just created. Naively, Peter used to believe that banks and building societies loaned out money that had been deposited at the bank by savers, people who wanted to earn interest on their savings. How foolish he had been. It was the creation of free and easy money combined with high demand for housing that had created a situation that was very difficult for the young. Peter walked up a short path and rang the doorbell. He needed a signature. A young guy in his late 20s opened the door with a smile. "James Jackson," said Peter. "That's me," said the man. "I just need a signature for this," said Peter. James, the man at the door, was wearing a white t-shirt with a Bitcoin logo on it. Peter thought to himself, it's almost like the universe is conspiring to make me take this Bitcoin thing seriously. "Bitcoin," said Peter, pointing at the t-shirt. James chuckled. "That's right. It's my ticket to freedom." "How so?" replied Peter. "It's the future of money," said James. "What about saving for a deposit to get a foot on the housing ladder?" asked Peter, interested in what James had to say. James said, "You're kidding. Most people of my age are up to their necks in student loan debt." Did you know that 2 million people in the UK owe at least £50,000 in student debt, and many even more? No, saving for a deposit is just an impossible dream, confirmed James. Most banks want first-time buyers to have a deposit of at least 15%. In London, you need to save at least £100,000 just for the deposit. And even if you did manage it, by the time you've saved enough, the price of the property has gone up so much, you still can't get a mortgage. I see, said Peter. So you think Bitcoin and renting is better? James was lively and animated. Look, I see it like this. Up until about 10 years ago, housing was the best opportunity. You could buy and live in a house at a reasonable price, and as its price appreciated, you automatically had an investment for the future. Real estate was like the golden ticket for past generations. All that has changed. Look, Albert Einstein famously said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. So, on average, the price of Bitcoin increases by at least 30% a year. Starting with £10,000, all you need to do is buy Bitcoin, and in 10 years, it will have grown to £137,000, and that's without buying any more. If you also buy Bitcoin each month, with what you have left over from your wages, you can achieve even more. It makes much more sense to rent. Who knows? In the future, perhaps I can consider property, but it's not just about the money. Bitcoin also gives me protection, freedom, and hope. How do you mean? Asked Peter. Look, we're entering a new era, James replied. Everybody can feel it, right? The world is changing at an incredible pace. Taking on a mortgage places a huge weight on your shoulders for decades or maybe even a lifetime. I refuse to be a debt slave. Taking on a mortgage means worry and having to work hard all your life. And if, at any time, you're unable to meet the monthly payments, the bank can just come and sell your house and throw you out. Owning a house also makes you vulnerable to the government and local council. They can decide to tax you more or whatever. If you own physical property, you can be victimised. That's a novel way of looking at it, said Peter. Look, said James, when you sit down and think about it objectively, aspiring to own your own property as a young person in the UK is just foolish. You've got the deposit, the estate agent, the council tax, the solicitor's fees, the taxes, and then there's the monthly repayments for the next 30 years or so. And for what? It's a roof over your head and a place to live, yes. But a wise financial move? I don't think so. It was clear to Peter that James had thought seriously about money, but also about the housing market and all its pitfalls, especially for the young. You said that Bitcoin was hope and freedom, Peter said. How do you mean? It's hope because it offers a way of escaping the system, James explained. The financial system that we have now is rigged against us. Property prices are skyrocketing, wages aren't keeping up, and savings are just like a melting ice cube thanks to inflation. But Bitcoin is different. It's finite. It's digital property. As more people understand its value and scarcity, its price will continue to rise. James paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. It's freedom because it's decentralized. No one controls Bitcoin. Governments can't print more of it, banks can't manipulate it, and if you own your own private keys, no one can seize it. It's financial sovereignty and freedom. For the first time in history, we have a form of money that's outside the control of any state or institution. Peter was impressed. I can tell that you genuinely believe it's a better option than owning property. For me and many in my generation, yes, James replied confidently. Real estate ties you down, both financially and physically. With Bitcoin, I can be anywhere in the world and still have access to my money. Plus, there are no maintenance costs, property taxes, or other hidden expenses. It's a way to be part of the global financial system that's fair and transparent. Peter nodded slowly. I see your point. James smiled. Sometimes the best opportunities are the ones that challenge the status quo. As Peter walked away, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of curiosity and possibility. The idea of Bitcoin as a beacon of hope and freedom was starting to resonate with him. Chapter 16. Argentina. Was Bitcoin really something that she and Peter were ready to invest in? The idea still felt so foreign, yet Susan also had a sense of excitement and hope for the future. Just like Peter, learning more about Bitcoin did not seem to quell her doubts. She wondered whether it was perhaps because Bitcoin was taking her out of her comfort zone. How did your day go? Inquired Susan as Peter arrived home. Very interesting, replied Peter. I met a guy in his 20s who's convinced that Bitcoin is going to free him and enable him to live the life that he wants. Peter told Susan more and all about what he'd learned. Maybe it's because we're not in the right environment, said Susan, suddenly and out of context. What do you mean? Said Peter. Well, everyone around us, in our daily lives, all our friends, and, even society at large, are still living in the same normal reality, said Susan. Look, we live in London, in the UK, one of the richest cities in the world. Maybe it's not the right environment to understand Bitcoin fully. I see, said Peter. Interesting thought. Go on. Susan continued. You know Helen? Well, she dances Argentine tango and they often go to Buenos Aires every other year to dance. She's told me that the inflation rate in Argentina is absolutely crazy and that the locals are always desperate to get their hands on dollars. She has friends, English friends, who live there. Maybe she could put us in touch with them. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Said Peter. A trip to Argentina, said Susan. We can't afford a trip. Even meeting the mortgage payments is a struggle. Or have you forgotten? Said Peter in a surprised tone. What about our emergency savings fund? Said Susan. But that's for a rainy day, said Peter. It's raining. Susan spoke softly. Look, we can't carry on like this. We've spent the past few weeks looking into Bitcoin. But we're in our own environment. Another good thing about a holiday is that it creates distance from the familiar. Holidays enable new thoughts and perspectives. Argentina has also just got a new president, and he said he wants Bitcoin to be an accepted method of payment in the country. He's already permitted contracts to be made in Bitcoin. Sounds like you've been doing your research, said Peter. We need a holiday too, protested Susan. It's been years. Oh, let me think it over, said Peter. Peter didn't know what to make of Susan's suggestion. On the one hand, he found it intriguing just how open-minded and determined Susan had become about fully understanding Bitcoin and how prepared she was to take action to improve their financial situation. On the other hand, however, dipping into their emergency savings for a holiday was something he couldn't imagine. But Susan's excitement and the idea of gaining a new perspective, that interested him. All right, Peter said, finally. Let's think this through. If we're going to use our savings, we need to be clever. We should plan this trip with the aim of learning as much as possible. I'd like to meet some locals and expats who are using Bitcoin and understand just how it's impacting their lives. Susan smiled, delighted that Peter was willing. I'll get in touch with Helen and see if she can put us in touch with some of her friends in Buenos Aires. Maybe you're right. A new environment might be exactly what we need to help us see things more clearly. We've been cautious our whole lives. Maybe it's time to take a calculated risk. Susan hugged him tightly. This could be the change we need, she said. As they sat down to dinner, the excitement of their upcoming adventure started to sink in. They began discussing the logistics, planning their itinerary, and imagining the possibilities that lay ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Susan contacted Helen, who was thrilled to help, and quickly put them in touch with her friends in Buenos Aires. They booked their flights, arranged accommodation, and made a list of places to visit and people to meet. Peter felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. This was the boldest move they had ever made. But he trusted Susan's instincts, and at the same time he was becoming increasingly curious about Bitcoin. Katie was also very excited about a holiday to Argentina. Shortly before departure, Susan's friend Helen dropped by to give them some tips. As they sat around the table, Helen explained, "If you're going to Argentina, you need to know about the blue dollar rate. It's the unofficial exchange rate for Western currencies like the pound and the dollar. You'll get far more pesos for your money than you will using a bank or other exchange place." Peter said questioningly, "That sounds a bit odd." Helen replied, "I think it's because of the high inflation. Prices are always rising, but I'm sure you'll be able to find out much more on the ground when you arrive in Argentina." Chapter 17. Tango and Chaos. Touching down in the bustling city of Buenos Aires, the air was warm and the energy of the city was palpable. They made their way to their hotel, nestled in the vibrant neighborhood of Palmero, known for its tree-lined streets, boutique shops, and lively cafes. Peter, Susan, and Katie would be staying for 3 weeks. Exchanging money was at the top of their to-do list. The friendly woman at the reception explained that they should head for Florida Street, where they would be inundated by people eager to do business with them. Peter asked if she knew the going exchange rate. She replied, laughing, "Everybody in Buenos Aires knows the going rate." Slightly uneasily, they made their way to Florida Street. Peter and Susan had wanted to escape their familiar surroundings and culture, and that they had certainly done. How different Buenos Aires was. "London feels so structured and orderly compared to this madness," Peter remarked, taking in the lively street vendors and the vibrant hustle of the city. Susan nodded. "It's certainly more chaotic here, but I like it. It has a charm. The energy is infectious." Peter agreed. "It's like everyone here is hustling, finding ways to make things work, despite all the economic problems. I think maybe in London we take stability for granted. Here it feels much more Darwinian and like a constant need for adaptation." They walked past grand old buildings with European architecture, juxtaposed with modern shops and graffiti murals. The contrast was striking. "Buenos Aires feels alive in a different way," Susan said. "There's a resilience here, a determination to survive and thrive, despite everything. It's inspiring, really." Peter smiled. "Maybe that's what we need to learn from this trip, to be more adaptable and resilient, to find opportunities even in difficult circumstances. As they approached Florida Street, they noticed groups of people calling out, "Cambio! Cambio!" offering to exchange money at the blue dollar rate. The bustling market atmosphere was a stark contrast to the more regulated environment they were used to back home. Peter felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "This is it," he said. "Let's see how this works." They spotted a friendly-looking exchanger and, after a brief negotiation, handed over their dollars in exchange for a thick wad of pesos. The transaction was quick, and they were soon back on the street with a new perspective on the local economy. Walking back to their hotel to put their money in the hotel safe as quickly as possible, Peter turned to Susan. "You were right. This trip is already opening our eyes. There's so much to understand about how different cultures manage their finances and lives in different ways." Susan smiled. "And we've only just begun. Hopefully we'll find out more about inflation and how the locals deal with all the frequent political disasters here." Helen had given Peter and Susan the contact details of her tango friends, Tom and Karen, who now lived in Buenos Aires. They arranged to meet at an afternoon milonga. A milonga is a place where people meet to dance tango socially. Tom had suggested that they come for the last hour to experience the culture, and then afterwards they could go for a meal with their friend Paco, an Argentine who spoke English very well and was a font of knowledge about all the country's political problems and persistent inflation. They'd arranged to meet at the door at 6 p.m. Tom and Karen were waiting when they arrived. The two couples introduced themselves and went over to sit at a table in the corner. The milonga was taking place in a large cafe. All the tables and chairs had been moved to the edges of the room to create a dance floor in the middle. It was crowded, on the floor and around. Susan was fascinated by how close the couples danced. Every 10 minutes or so, the dance floor would clear and people would look for their next dance partner by making eye contact. It was a totally different culture and something that Peter and Susan had never experienced before. The milonga ended at 7 p.m. and the four of them made their way to a local restaurant to meet Paco. "Wow, the prices here are a fraction of what we pay in London," said Peter. "Let's treat ourselves while we can." Tom and Karen had been living in Buenos Aires for 5 years. They were both in their early 60s and had been able to retire early simply because the cost of living in Argentina was so much more affordable than in the UK. They drew their pensions from the UK, so they could easily afford to live there. "So what made you move to Argentina? Was it just the tango?" asked Susan. Tom was tall and slim and still had a full head of hair. He had a confident demeanour. Karen was an attractive woman with blonde hair and a very friendly smile. Initially, yes, but it was also the opportunity that it offered. When we first visited, much like you, we were blown away by just how cheap everything was for us compared to the UK. Taxis, restaurants, rental apartments, everything was just so much cheaper, said Karen. "We also like Buenos Aires a lot," said Tom. "The streets are clean and the city has a vibrant energy. But of course, this is the birthplace and the home of tango. We can dance here whenever we want, in the afternoon, in the evening, or even into the early hours. Lessons are inexpensive and it's just a great way of life. When we do go back to the UK, we're always astounded at how much everything costs. It just feels like a huge rip-off," continued Karen. "Of course, it's only cheap here in Buenos Aires for us and other foreigners. For the locals, everything is expensive, with inflation at nearly 100% and prices rising all the time," said Tom. While they were browsing the menu, the door opened, and from Karen's reaction, they could tell that Paco had just arrived. He came over to their table to greet them. He was around 5'9" and walked quickly with a very friendly demeanour. He came over to the table and greeted all four of them as if they'd been friends for years. Paco had grown up in Buenos Aires. His father had founded a business selling spare parts for cars in the 1960s. The company had grown, and Paco now oversaw a workforce of around 60. "Tom tells me you're interested in our crazy economy here in Argentina," said Paco. Peter explained to Paco the reason behind their trip to Argentina and about all the things that they had already learned. He explained that above all, they wanted to come here to see how money and Bitcoin could work in a different environment. "Well, I'm sure the way the economy functions here in Argentina is completely different to anything you've experienced before. For one, nobody here trusts the government, the institutions, and above all else, the banks. Because between 1999 and 2002, millions of people with money in the bank lost their life savings due to the currency devaluation and the banking restrictions. You'd have to be crazy to put your money in the bank here. People here want to own dollars, either in foreign banks, safe deposit boxes, or even under the mattress. The government actually recently said that Argentines owned more than $246 billion worth of dollars in total. Owning dollars here is one of the ways you can protect yourself from the state." "Because of inflation?" asked Susan. "Because the politicians and the banks are criminals," replied Paco. "They just print more and more pesos. It's crazy. Printing worthless paper money has been the preferred response to all of the challenges here for decades. It's theft on a huge scale. It's a problem because the printing of money is little understood here. It's used by the elite class to steal the time and the energy of the people. Just please stop me if I get too carried away, but I'm really passionate about explaining the damage caused by printing money." No, please continue," said Susan. "It's the reason we're here." Paco continued. "Look, when we produce anything of value, we invest time and energy. The fisherman, the builder, the baker, the taxi driver, they all have to invest time and energy, and in return, they receive money, or more accurately, currency. The money they receive reflects the time and energy, or value, that they've contributed to someone else, or, on a larger scale, to society. People should be able to save that money until a later date, or until they're older, and then redeem it for roughly the same amount of time and energy that they put into earning it. Does that make sense? Am I making sense?" "I think so," said Peter. Paco continued. "Okay, maybe this will help make it a little clearer. Please bear with me. Why do we value life? We value life because it's limited. We all know that we have around 80 years, and then we die. It's because life is limited that we value it. If we were immortal, we could put off having kids for 100,000 years and endless other things. We would not value life in the same way. And it's the same with real money. Because of the current fiat system of money, politicians have access to an unlimited supply of money at no cost to them. When the government uses some convoluted and complicated sounding process to print money at no cost, it's not created any value at all. It's not put in any work or energy or built something useful. It's simply pressed a button on a keyboard. Access to unlimited money at no cost, it just leads to huge waste. The government does not value the money because it's easy and free for the government. In reality, the political class and those close to them are stealing the money from everyone else. They call it inflation, but it's theft. People complain that prices are going up, but they don't realise that the government is basically just robbing them of their time and energy, their money. It's a racket. Susan spoke up. A man we talked to back in London said more or less the same thing. Perhaps the difference in London is that we don't notice it to the same extent. Inflation back in the UK has been low now for the past decade, but it's been rising steeply since COVID. But it's still less than 10%. Paco said, "Oh, you notice it here all right. Politicians will blame anyone and everyone for our economic mess. They are masters at deflecting blame. Did you know that Argentina used to be one of the richest countries in the world? In just a couple of generations, we've gone from rich to poor to beggars. It's so sad. But things are actually beginning to change. We have a new president called Javier Milei, who was elected on a pledge of abolishing the central bank and stopping all the money printing. He's also in favour of Bitcoin, actually, and he's even said that he's in favour of it being accepted as a form of currency." So, what is the situation here in Buenos Aires with regard to Bitcoin? Asked Peter. "It's so exciting," said Paco. "I actually feel that we might be on the verge of a real and positive revolution. The people who have been exchanging their pesos for Bitcoin have done much better than those who exchange them for dollars. And word is spreading that holding Bitcoin rather than dollars is actually a far better strategy. Not only that, our new president has been over to El Salvador to meet their president, Nayib Bukele. In El Salvador, Bitcoin is now legal tender, and the government buys Bitcoin whenever it can. There are rumours that Argentina might adopt the same or similar policies. That would be astonishing. And there's more. A state-owned energy company has announced that it's going to start mining Bitcoin using stranded natural gas. "Sorry to interrupt," said Susan, "but what is mining Bitcoin?" Bitcoin mining is a term used to describe a key element in securing the Bitcoin network. It's one of the reasons why Bitcoin is the most secure computer network in the world. Mining is also the way in which new Bitcoins are created and transactions verified. I'm glad you asked, actually, because for me, the secure nature of Bitcoin is one of its most fascinating aspects. Bitcoin mining is also known as proof of work. Look, it's all a bit technical, but for me, the most elegant and, quite frankly, most mind-blowing part of Bitcoin is how Bitcoin mining effectively brings together the physical world in the form of electricity with the virtual world to create an impenetrable system. Do you mind if I tell a little story that I love so much? "We're all ears," replied Peter. Paco started to tell the story. In 2011, Dan Kaminsky, a leading internet security researcher, investigated Bitcoin, and he was sure he would find major weaknesses. Kaminsky is famous amongst hackers for discovering in 2008 a fundamental flaw in the internet which would have allowed a skilled coder to take over any website or even to shut down the internet. Kaminsky alerted the Department for Homeland Security and executives at Microsoft and Cisco to the problem and worked with them to patch it. He's one of the most adept practitioners of penetration testing, which is the art of compromising the security of computer systems at the behest of owners who want to know exactly how vulnerable that system is. Guess what he said when he tried to break Bitcoin? This is what he said. "When I first looked at the code, I was sure I was going to be able to break it." He thought he'd identified 9 ways to compromise the system and sourced the code for an insertion point for his first attack. But when he found the right spot, there was a message waiting for him. "Attack removed," it said. The same thing happened over and over, infuriating Kaminsky. Kaminsky said, I came up with beautiful bugs, but every time I went after the code, there was a line that addressed the problem. He was like a burglar who was certain he could break into a bank by digging a tunnel, drilling through a wall, or climbing down a vent. And on each attempt, he discovered a freshly poured cement barrier with a sign just telling him to go home. I'd never seen anything like it, Kaminsky said. He was absolutely in awe. Either there's a team of people who worked on this, or this guy is a genius. Wow, that does sound impressive, said Peter. So you think Bitcoin has a big future in Argentina? Yes, said Paco. I believe that most people discover Bitcoin on a need-to-know basis. Let me explain. What I mean is, those with the greatest need to discover and embrace Bitcoin faster than those with less need. The Argentine people have a much greater need to know than people in the UK. People living in stable economies like the UK, with a comfortable life and a traditional finance system that still works, don't need to know about a superior alternative with the same urgency as people here in Argentina. Especially the younger generations, they're beginning to realise that Bitcoin offers them a way to escape the desperate economic situation that we have here. Holding Bitcoin is much better than holding dollars. Its average annual growth rate is far higher than the dollar. It's more secure, it cannot be seized by the government or banks, and it's impossible to print or create more of it. More and more people are waking up to its benefits. This is fascinating, said Tom, who was only there with Helen because they'd met at the Tango meeting. And he said, I'm learning a lot. This is amazing. I've been living here all this time and I'm getting my first real insight into all the craziness that I see on a day-to-day basis. Tom then continued, to be honest, I was under the impression that Bitcoin is just a bubble, like tulips. Paco cheerfully said, lots of people have heard that, but it's not true. The tulip bubble happened over the space of 1 year. Bitcoin's already been around for 15 years at this point, and over that time we've had huge increases in price and also big drawbacks, but the direction of Bitcoin is upwards. In addition, tulips are not scarce. More can be grown if the price increases. For Bitcoin, it's the opposite. There's a fixed supply and a natural decrease in the number of new Bitcoins every 4 years. Tom replied, so you don't believe Bitcoin can go to zero? Well, put it this way, said Paco. After spending hundreds of hours researching Bitcoin, I decided to go all in 5 years ago, not just privately, but for my company too. Whenever the business makes a profit, we exchange the pesos for Bitcoin. So far, it's been a very shrewd decision. Our car parks business is far more financially sound than before. But most importantly, there's no way that I would have done this if I thought Bitcoin was going to fail. No, quite the opposite. I believe that Bitcoin is going to slowly gain adoption throughout the rest of the world. Now clearly interested in the conversation, Tom said, it's a shame I'm useless with computers and technology. I don't think I would ever trust myself enough to try and buy any. Just buy a Bitcoin ETF from your bank, just as you would shares, said Peter. No need for any special skills or knowledge. Susan spoke up. The motivation for our trip to Argentina was to experience a different environment where people were not so comfortable with the financial system. We had the feeling that in London, we were not in the right place to pluck up the courage to actually, take action and buy Bitcoin. We're thinking of selling our house to buy Bitcoin. I see, said Paco. I had the same fears, but now I try to get rid of my pesos as quickly as I can, and I exchange them to Bitcoin even faster. The more you learn, the more confident you become. Peter and Susan made their way back by foot to their holiday apartment. It was a mild autumn evening in Buenos Aires, and Peter and Susan just strolled, enjoying the new impressions and a different place. Isn't it odd how going on holiday opens your mind to new ideas and thoughts? London seems a million miles away right now. It was a good idea to come here, to come to Argentina, said Peter. Chapter 18. Time to think. Breakfast in Buenos Aires. I still can't believe we're here, said Susan, sitting around with Peter and Katie at the breakfast table. Let's go for a long walk and discover a bit more of the city and the culture. When it came to discovering unfamiliar cities, Peter and Susan enjoyed walking and disliked sightseeing buses. Once, in Barcelona, they'd made the mistake of getting on a bus and going for a tour of the city. They had hated it. Stuck in traffic most of the time, the bus had made them feel disconnected from the city. So they got off, unable to suffer the experience any longer. Now that is a good idea, said Peter. What do you say, Katie? Katie replied that she would like to visit the La Boca area of Buenos Aires. I've seen it on Instagram. There's a street with painted houses, street art, tango shows, and just loads going on. Can we go there if we're going to be walking? They all agreed and took a taxi across town and started their exploration by foot. One of the great things about walking and talking is that somehow it helps to make ideas and concepts become more concrete. Walking through the vibrant streets of La Boca, Peter said, so if we really sell our house for Bitcoin, what would our new life look like? Susan thought for a moment. Well, first we'd need to find somewhere to live. We'd rent at first until we see how things pan out. Just think how flexible we would be. Katie chimed in. It'd be weird moving home. What about all our stuff? Peter nodded. We'd have to downsize quite a bit. But think about the freedom. If we're renting, we can move more easily and we'd have the money to do more things, like this holiday. And it would not necessarily have to be living in London. As they continued the walk, they were captivated by the sights and sounds around them. The streets of La Boca were alive with energy. Brightly painted houses in bold shades of blue, green and yellow lined the cobblestone streets, giving the area a cheerful and vibrant feel. Street artists displayed their work, ranging from traditional paintings to contemporary pieces that captured the spirit of Buenos Aires. Susan pointed out a group of tango dancers performing in the street, their movements fluid and passionate. The sound of the bandoneon filled the air, adding to the authentic Argentine atmosphere. Look at them, so graceful. Tango really is a beautiful dance, Susan remarked. They passed by a bustling marketplace where vendors sold a variety of goods, from handmade crafts and souvenirs to delicious local foods. The aroma of freshly grilled empanadas and choripan filled the air, tempting their taste buds. Katie insisted that they tried some local delicacies, and they stopped for a quick snack. Susan continued the conversation. There's also the money side of things. If Bitcoin's value continues to rise over the coming years, we would have far more security and freedom, and we would be, well, debt-free. Of course, if the price goes down, we'll need to be resilient. Peter agreed. True, its dollar value can fluctuate massively. But from everything we've learned, provided we hold on for the long term, we should be fine. Maybe the best plan is just to sell the house, buy Bitcoin, pay off our debts, and then just not look at the price for at least 5 years, Katie asked. So more holidays? Peter smiled. If Bitcoin does well, we could afford more travel and we'd be able to help you more depending on what you want to do in life. Look, every investment has risks. That's one of the reasons that we're down here in Argentina. We're trying to learn as much as we can so that we feel confident about what we're planning. As they walked, they came across a lively plaza where children played and musicians performed. The atmosphere was festive, with laughter and music blending into a joyful symphony. Susan noticed a mural depicting the history of La Boca, showing scenes of the neighbourhood's immigrant roots and its development over the years. Their day had been a huge success. All three of them, Peter, Susan and Katie, were feeling more and more confident about the future and their next steps. On their last day in Buenos Aires, Peter, Susan and Katie decided to visit a local cafe they'd heard about. This wasn't just any cafe, but one known for accepting Bitcoin as payment. As they entered, they were greeted by a friendly barista who spoke English. They ordered their coffee and pastries, and when it came to pay, Peter mentioned they wanted to use Bitcoin. The barista, whose name was Maria, smiled. "Of course we can do that. Do you have a Lightning app installed on your phone?" Peter looked a bit puzzled. "I have the Strike app." Maria smiled enthusiastically. "That will do fine. Here, let me show you." Maria guided Peter through the steps. She explained that the Lightning Network is a layer on top of Bitcoin that allows for faster and cheaper transactions. "Done," Maria said. "You can pay by just scanning this QR code with your new Lightning Wallet app." Peter followed her instructions and was amazed at how quick and seamless the transaction was. Wow, that was fast. Susan watched with interest. "So, how long have you been accepting Bitcoin?" Maria replied, "For about 2 years now. Our owner is a huge fan of Bitcoin. He believes that Bitcoin is replacing everything and says that with Bitcoin we can live in the future today. In Argentina, the currency is a nightmare, you've probably noticed. Not long ago, we were having to change the peso prices of everything in here on a weekly basis. So basically, every single week, all the prices were changing in the shop." Peter nodded. "We're trying to learn as much as we can about Bitcoin." Maria continued, "We get a lot of tourists who play with Bitcoin, but more and more locals are starting to use it too. They want to protect their savings from the government and from inflation." As they enjoyed their coffee, Peter and Susan reflected on their trip. They had come to Argentina to understand the real-world use of Bitcoin, and now, sitting in a cafe that accepted it as payment, they felt they had come full circle. "This trip has been eye-opening," Susan said. "I think we've learned enough to make an informed decision." "I agree," said Peter. "Maybe it is time to take the next step. But what will we think when we get back to our own environment?" As they finished their coffee, Peter and Susan felt a sense of excitement and readiness for the future. They knew the decision to sell their house for Bitcoin was a big one, but they felt more confident and more prepared than ever. Chapter 19. FOMO. Peter and Susan quickly slipped back into their daily routines. Despite having agreed to act and make their Bitcoin plans reality, neither of them seemed to want to grasp the nettle and set things in motion. It was almost as if something was still missing. Every day Peter would walk past the house that started his journey in the first place, and every day it would make him think and wonder. In Argentina, he'd felt so sure and certain, but now, back in London and back on his round, the world just seemed different again. He would try to imagine what would happen if he was wrong about Bitcoin, and it went down in value, or worse. He and Susan would end up losing all their wealth. Peter was frightened of making the wrong decision and having massive regrets. And there was something else. Everyone around him, most people, all had an opinion on Bitcoin. He knew that the majority thought that Bitcoin was a scam, a bubble, a Ponzi scheme, and that Bitcoin had absolutely no value at all. Peter knew that his family, his friends, would also think the same way. So if Bitcoin did go to zero or fail, it would leave him and Susan looking really stupid. It's funny, he thought to himself. If Susan and he invested all their money in a house or a pension fund and they failed for some reason, no one would think they had been stupid. On the contrary, most would probably garner sympathy. That's because it's normal. Everyone wants a house or a private pension. The more he thought about it, the more he began to realise that perhaps it was the social stigma that was holding him back and not the actual investment, which he now understood and really believed in. That evening, Peter was staring out of the living room window, lost in thought. Susan entered, noticing his thoughtful mood. "You seem distant," Susan asked, standing beside him. Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about Argentina and our plans with Bitcoin. I think our problem might be that we're, cowards, Susan. The thing is that if Bitcoin crashes and we lose everything, everyone will think that we're stupid. Maybe it's the fear of what everyone else thinks that's holding us back, more than the investment itself." Susan took his hand. "Interesting. So you're saying it's not just about the money, it's about the fear of making a mistake and looking foolish in front of our family and friends." Peter nodded. "Exactly. It's like everyone expects us to fail if we go through with this." Susan leaned back, thoughtful. When we were in Argentina, everything felt clear. But here, back in London, I don't know, it's just different. The doubts are stronger and the pressure from what others think is, palpable. At that moment, Katie burst in, waving a colourful flyer. "Look at this," she exclaimed. "There's a Bitcoin seminar happening next week, right here in Southwark. Interested?" Peter and Susan exchanged glances. "A Bitcoin seminar," Peter said, taking the flyer from Katie. Perfect timing. The Bitcoin seminar was taking place on Saturday. There was a presentation in the morning, then a break for lunch, and the afternoon was all about taking questions from the attendees and exchanging thoughts and concerns. Peter and Susan arrived with a mix of optimism and curiosity. The room was buzzing with attendees, mainly young adults, but also a few people in their 50s and 60s. The presentation began. It was given by a young chap in his early 30s called Jack. He was so enthusiastic and so full of life. Peter and Susan had already learned and heard about many of the topics covered in the presentation, but nevertheless, it was great to sit, listen, and contemplate them again. After lunch, it was time for the Q&A. "Right then," said Jack. "Does anyone have a question?" First to speak was a middle-aged man who raised his hand and then stood up. Denial etched on his face. He spoke slowly. "I have a question, but I'd just like to mention that I'm here because my wife forced me into it. So, with that clear, my question is, isn't Bitcoin just a scam? I mean, it doesn't really exist. You can't hold it in your hand. I have a strong suspicion that it's nothing more than a Ponzi. It's worthless." "If it's worthless, send some to me for free," came a random voice from the attendees. There was some laughter. Jack remained calm before responding, a knowing smile on his face. Thank you for your question. I totally understand why you might think that. Almost everyone does when they first hear about Bitcoin. Let's address the notion of Bitcoin being a Ponzi scheme. First, a Ponzi scheme is a fraudulent investment scam promising high returns with little risk, where the returns are paid to earlier investors from the new investors, rather than profit. It collapses when there aren't enough new investors to sustain it. Bitcoin is fundamentally different. It operates on a decentralized network known as a blockchain, where transactions are verified by a global network of computers, not by any single entity. This transparency and decentralization are key differences. Bitcoin's value is determined by supply and demand in the market, just similar to any other asset. Now, regarding fiat money, Jack continued, many critics argue that the current fiat monetary system has characteristics reminiscent of a Ponzi scheme. Governments and central banks continually print more money, increasing debt to pay off existing debt, leading to inflation and devaluation of currency. This cycle relies on continuous new borrowing, much like how a Ponzi scheme relies on new investors. Bitcoin, however, has a fixed supply of 21 million coins. No more can be created. This ensures scarcity and potential value preservation over time. It's designed to be deflationary, contrasting with the inflationary nature of fiat money. So in essence, while Bitcoin is new and different from traditional assets, calling it a Ponzi scheme is misunderstanding it. It's an alternative financial system that offers transparency, decentralization, and a hedge against the potential pitfalls of the current fiat system. The room was silent for a moment, then filled with nods of understanding and a few murmurs of agreement. Next was a younger woman who seemed a little bit unsure. She raised her hand before saying, I do think that Bitcoin is a thing, but isn't it too good to be true? I mean, surely the government's going to ban it. Jack responded by explaining that if the government was going to ban it, the US wouldn't be bragging about having captured 3 billion of it and selling it in the open market, nor would they have approved the ETFs or fought over who gets jurisdiction over it. He went on to explain that some of the largest financial institutions in the world, including BlackRock and Fidelity, are now invested in Bitcoin. In the past, there was much more uncertainty from a regulation standpoint, but for Bitcoin at least, that danger has passed. A man in his 30s then stood up. I've been thinking of buying Bitcoin to make money, and then my plan would be to invest any proceeds I have into, more traditional proven assets. My idea is to build a pension pot. What do you think? Well, said Jack from the stage, Bitcoin is a very difficult asset to trade. No other asset behaves like it, and most of the people who trade it get their fingers burnt. However, no one who bought Bitcoin and then simply held it for at least 4 years has ever lost money. Pick any moment in time in Bitcoin's history, fast forward 4 years, and you will be in profit. The longer you hold it, the more Bitcoin rewards you. Not only that, you can just sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride without getting too focused on the day-to-day up and downs. A woman who appeared to be in her 40s then raised her hand before asking, I've been studying Bitcoin for months now. I've listened a lot to Michael Saylor, and I'd just like your thoughts on the following. How does Bitcoin compare to other successful technologies and companies such as Google, Apple, Microsoft, water, electricity, cars, and planes even? Jack replied, personally, I'd put it on a par with electricity. Maybe it's even more significant. Electricity fundamentally changed our lives and did so much to grow civilization. It was huge. But money is at the very core of our civilization. Without money, nothing works. There's no trade, no economy, nothing. Even today, it's clear what happens when money breaks. Just look at Venezuela or Zimbabwe. It's a disaster. In 1971, President Nixon took the world off the gold standard, and since then, every country in the world has just been printing money. Some more than others, but global debt is huge, and the only response is to create more debt, or in other words, print more money. So yes, I think that Bitcoin is as significant as electricity because it's the only technology with the potential to save us from the broken fiat money system. Finally, a young man at the back of the room stood up. So, you believe Bitcoin is an instrument of economic empowerment, he said. It's not just an investment, it's a way to achieve financial independence and actually challenge the status quo. Jack smiled, agreeing wholeheartedly. He explained how Bitcoin provides a decentralized financial system, free from government control, allowing individuals to truly own their wealth. Susan nudged Peter and whispered, "Ask him about what he thinks about selling a house to buy Bitcoin." Peter hesitated for a moment, then raised his hand. Excuse me, he began. My wife and I have been considering selling our house to invest in Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on that? The presenter, Jack, looked thoughtful. That's a bold move, he replied, but it's not unheard of. The key is understanding your risk tolerance and financial situation. Bitcoin is a volatile asset, and while it has shown tremendous growth over the long term, of course, there are no guarantees. But to be fair, there are no guarantees no matter what you invest in. If you believe in the technology and its future potential, it could be a really shrewd move. A man in his 50s, sitting a few rows ahead, chimed in. I did it. I sold my house and went all in on Bitcoin a few years ago. It was a hard decision, but it paid off. I did loads of research first and prepared myself mentally for the ups and downs. Jack nodded from the raised floor that was serving as a stage. That's amazing. Peter and Susan were intrigued by the man's story and wanted to know more. After the seminar, they approached him. Hi, I'm Peter and this is my wife Susan. We were really interested in what you said about selling your house for Bitcoin. Can we ask you a few questions? The man smiled warmly. Of course. I'm Mark, by the way. I know it sounds extreme, but yeah, what do you want to know? Peter glanced at Susan before speaking. We've been thinking of doing the same thing. Was there any one thing that finally convinced you to go through with it and turn all the deliberations into action? Mark replied, That's easy. FOMO. You see, I'd always been curious about Bitcoin, but I got serious when all the madness broke out in 2020. We were banned from leaving home, so I started going much deeper into Bitcoin. The more I found out, the more convinced I became. All the while, the price of Bitcoin kept edging up, and then in October, the price increase started to accelerate. I just got FOMO, laughed Mark. That's when I rushed out, put the house up for sale, sold it as quickly as I could, and bought Bitcoin. What's FOMO? Asked Susan. Oh, sorry, it stands for fear of missing out, said Mark. It's that feeling you get when you think you're going to be too late. Peter and Susan nodded, absorbing his words. So, how's it been since you made the switch? Peter asked. Mark smiled. It's been a wild ride. I paid $25,000 per Bitcoin in December 2020. I was terrified. It just seemed crazy. Then the price went all the way to $69,000 before crashing back down to $20,000 just over a year later. But now we're back at 70,000. As of this moment, I've tripled my money in just over 3 years. But it took nerves of steel. And now? How do you feel now? Asked Susan. I'm relaxed now, replied Mark. I've been on a roller coaster ride and got back to the start line. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that your commitment must be absolutely rock solid. Had I got cold feet at the bottom of the market, I would be far poorer than I am now. My tip to everyone would be to do your homework, make a decision for the long term, and then see it through. Thanks, Mark, said Peter. I think you've helped us a lot. Mark replied, Don't worry what others think. Most people haven't got a clue about Bitcoin. My advice would be to decide what you want to do and then make it happen. Chapter 20. Will they? Won't they? Peter put down the pen and slid the paper over to Susan. What do you think? He asked. Susan scrutinized the final number. It's more or less what I expected, she said. Are you sure you've accounted for everything? All the fees, estate agent costs, the lot? Everything, said Peter. We'd be completely free of debt. No mortgage, no car loan, no outstanding credit card balance, nothing. And we'd still be left with around £300,000, asked Susan. Yep, said Peter confidently. Susan had forgotten what it was like to live without debt. She and Peter had been together for nearly 30 years. After just 2 years together, they took out a mortgage to buy their first property. They moved 5 years later, taking on more debt, and around 10 years ago, they had remortgaged the house and increased the financial burden even more. Like many other families, they had a car loan, an all but maxed out credit card, which they rolled over each month at a stupidly high credit rate. Just imagine it, no more debt, said Susan. It's exciting just thinking about it. Okay then, now for the 3 scenarios. Susan and Peter had set aside this Sunday afternoon to go through the numbers and put together 3 scenarios on paper. Best case, likely case, and worst case scenario. Let's start with the worst case, said Peter. We find a place to rent and we buy Bitcoin. We said that we'd put around 80% of our savings into Bitcoin, so that's £240,000. That would leave us with £60,000 in cash for emergencies. Then, let's say Bitcoin really does go to zero. I mean, worst case is worst case, right? That would leave us without any savings outside of the money that we've set aside, and of course, we would no longer own a house. But we could certainly survive that, right? Replied Susan. I mean, it would be bad, and we would certainly look like fools. But financially speaking, we would survive. Our wages would still be coming in, which hopefully would cover our rent with a little to spare. And we'd always still have the option of moving out of London to somewhere cheaper, said Peter. To be honest, I'm surprised. The worst case scenario doesn't actually seem that catastrophic. Agreed, said Susan. Let's do the likely case. Okay, Peter looked enthusiastic. The same as before, only this time Bitcoin either stagnates in price or slightly increases each year. This scenario would leave us basically where we are now financially. We would no longer be on the housing ladder, but we would be financially free and we wouldn't be in debt to anyone. So, not bad, eh? An optimistic smile covered Susan's face. Not bad at all, she said. I never realised how uplifting just the thought of being debt-free would be. I like this. Come on, let's do the best case scenario. Peter cleared his throat. Right then, let's not go too overboard, but there's really no limit to how optimistic we can get. Bitcoin could go to zero, that's the worst case. But theoretically, there's almost no limit on how high it could go. But I want to stay grounded. So I thought I would take a look at the compounded annual growth rate of Bitcoin over the past 14 years. Online, the figure of 61% kept coming up, but it's far more mature now as an asset, so it's fair to expect this number will actually decrease. Let's be really conservative and go with 25% compound interest over the coming 10 years. Fair enough, said Susan. Peter entered the numbers into an online calculator. Oh, that can't be right, he said. I'll try again. Peter's expression was one of disbelief. After 10 years, our Bitcoin would have a value of £2,900,000, he said. Susan went over to the laptop to check that Peter was doing it right. They spent a good half hour checking and double checking the figures, but the numbers kept coming out the same. What is it after 5 years? Said Susan. £826,000, replied Peter. Peter went over to the fridge and pulled out 2 cold bottles of beer. They both sat at the table going through the numbers some more. Then they went back and forth between the worst case and the best case. The beer tasted incredibly good, and the future was looking really bright. So are we going to do it or not? Said Peter. Let's do it, said Susan, reaching out her hand to Peter. Peter took her hand, looked her in the eyes and said, let's do it. A week later, Peter was outside, putting up the for sale sign on his house. Delivery, came a voice from behind him. Oh, I didn't see you there, said Peter. Selling the house then, came the reply. Yes, said Peter, time to part company. No more daylight robbery from the bank and no more monthly loan payments. Are you moving out of town? Asked the delivery driver. No, replied Peter. Well, we've decided to sell this place and buy Bitcoin with the proceeds. We're going to be renting from now on. Then, in a few years, our plan is to buy the home that we have always wanted, in cash and completely mortgage-free. Bitcoin, came a surprised reply. You're brave. Peter had a feeling of déjà vu as he recalled his own journey. Not so long ago the roles had been reversed, and it had been him standing there saying, you're brave. He felt the need to say something, to plant a tiny seed. To be honest, said Peter, I don't feel particularly brave. We've spent hundreds of hours looking into this, and we're convinced that it's the right move. We're tired of being broke at the end of each month with no hope on the horizon. Wow, said the delivery driver. I could never do that. Are you sure? Replied Peter. Are you really sure? The end. Outro. Congratulations on reaching the end of this audiobook. I really hope you enjoyed it. About me, the author, Alan Twigg. In 2023, I sold my house to buy Bitcoin. I was born in Sheffield, England, and with a working class background, and I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. I'm fluent in 3 languages and I've lived in the UK, Germany, Spain, and Portugal. I founded several successful businesses, including an employment agency, a translation company, an online marketing agency, and an events business. I'm a father of 4 and grandfather of 6. I'm curious, energetic, and always eager to embrace change. Disclaimer. This book is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are the products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events, or locals is purely coincidental. The content of this book is intended for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, investment, or professional advice. The scenarios and actions of the characters, including the buying and selling of assets such as Bitcoin, are fictional and should not be interpreted as real-life guidance or recommendations. Readers are advised to consult with a qualified financial advisor or conduct their own research before making any financial decisions. The author and publisher disclaim any liability for any financial loss or other damages incurred as a result of actions taken based on the content of this book. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved.